All right, welcome everyone to our City Council workshop. In this workshop, we're going to talk about the general plan overview. We have 5 issues that we're going to talk about. It's an informal meeting of the council, and so I would like there to, people to feel comfortable, the council to feel comfortable asking questions. And I think the format that we'll start out with is have the presentation and then have questions, or if you have questions during the presentation. Melinda, is that okay?
Yeah.
To have, okay, just kind of a free flow of ideas, since this is education and information that I think is really important for the council. And we have all council members present, including Rosalba Dominguez and Kat Martinez, who are joining us via Zoom. So welcome, everybody. And we will get started. And Melinda?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting us here today to be with you. Know that the goal today, by the end of the time with Jared here, is to have each of you become certified planners. They've been working with me the last couple of years to get me to more of a planner mindset. My background is more general than that, but what we wanted to start with, of course, was an overview of the general plan that was adopted in 2017. We have put together a presentation for that, which we'll just kind of do a little bit of the history, talk about some of the key initiatives of the plan and how we work through that plan when projects come to us. And if anyone does have questions throughout the presentation, please just feel free to interrupt. And because Jared is the planning expert on staff, he'll be doing most of the presenting as far as the general plan information. And so we have also provided to each of the council members, and Councilmember Dominguez will get one to you, but we have printouts of the slides that we're sharing today. So if you want to make notes as you go along, you can do that. And I think that's about everything. So I'll just turn the time over to Jared. And again, if there's any questions, please feel free to let us know. And I can monitor the chat too for Rosalba and Kat if you wanted to put questions in there. So we can just get started, and I'll turn it over to Jared.
Okay.
Jared, welcome.
Thank you.
I didn't formally welcome you, so thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your expertise. And you are what is your formal title, actually?
I'm the planning division manager.
Okay. All right. So you're the head planner. Thank you.
That's what they tell me. I'm not entirely sure every day, but so far.
Yes.
So can you all see the council workshop screen there?
Yep.
Okay, great. And like Melinda said, I'm happy to kind of pause whenever anybody has a question or comment or such, and we can take it as we go, because it is workshop. So I'd like you all to be able to feel like your questions are answered, or at least we're on the right track for that as we go. So, but with that in mind, like Melinda said, we did want to talk about just the Murray City General Plan. Move this over here a little bit. Are you all seeing that as well? I don't have 2 screens. Okay, good.
Yes.
I don't know how to get rid of that, actually.
We got it.
Oh yeah, it's good. Okay.
Oh, you mean
that? So
yeah,
that's probably better. Okay. So the general plan, the Murray's general plan, was adopted in 2017. So we refer to it typically as the 2017 general plan. We did kick off the process of getting that plan adopted in 2014 in October. So it took a while to get done. There were a couple of reasons for that. They do generally take a little time anyway. They're a large document. They're a big undertaking, so it takes a little time. Ours took a little longer than we expected, but we did kick off in 2014. We tried to do a lot of public involvement. We held 4 open houses during those couple of years. We had 5 focus groups that met to provide comment. And we did, part of what took so much time was that we stopped mid-plan and did a scientific community survey that went out, asking about different aspects of the general plan and a couple of other things as well. And then during the whole process, there was a website always available for comments. We got a lot of good comments through the website as well. It did take us until March of 2017 to get the formal adoption done. That was after the Planning Commission's public hearings and the city councils as well. Those were fairly well attended. Make sure my volume's down and my mic's up. Oh, you're good. The plan is structured a little differently. Part of the still. Oh, you're fine. Thanks. So while we were producing the plan, or while we were doing the research and getting it ready, the consultants and staff came up with a different kind of a concept to produce the plan in 2 parts. The first part being sort of more, we hoped, more accessible, a kind of a big overview, and it would contain a couple of elements that were different, but they would be the more sort of big picture items, so that people that wanted to, that were maybe put off by a 200-page document or a big thick book would at least want to look at the first part. So that part 1 is what we're going to talk about first. The second part is more in depth, and we use that more often in terms of evaluating projects against the general plan, et cetera. It's set up more as a traditional general plan. But the first part we refer to kind of as the big picture. It's got a lot of information in it, a lot of history of the city, a lot of demographic information, and an overview of the contents as a part of that part 1. And then it also identifies what they called the 5 key initiatives that were sort of distilled from all of the ideas that we bounced around during the production of the plan, with the focus groups and with the community meetings and just the ideas that we had put forth and wanted to get input on. Those got distilled into 12 big ideas, and we told the consultants that's too many. So we wanted 3, we settled on 5 key initiatives to kind of keep people's focus a little more. Those encompass those 12 bigger items or smaller items, depending on how you look at it. Also in the big picture part of it, in the first part of the plan, we identified small area planning projects. That became a focus early on. We felt like, as we talked about these different areas of the city, these different parts of the city kept coming up, and we kept thinking we want to drill down on that area more. We really couldn't do that as much in the general plan as we wanted. And so the consultants helped us identify areas for small planning projects. And we'll talk about that more as we get into the body of the project as well.
So we have provided, I know you guys all have a copy of the general plan, but we took these 2 pages out. I printed those off separately because we'll refer back to those quite a bit. And so we wanted to have those kind of front and center for you to look at and have access to. But as Jared said, really everything else from the general plan funnels back to these 5 key initiatives.
Perfect, thank you. And then in addition to those initiatives and the small area planning projects, the end of that first part of the plan is a listing of the best practices and standards that we've relied on as we put the plan together. NACDO standards, Landscape Architecture Association standards, things like that.
What's NACDO?
That, you got me. National Association of Transportation Construction, something or other.
Okay.
Has to do with transportation standards. Lane widths and all those kind of things, that lots of numbers. So we talked about, as Melinda mentioned, the 5 key initiatives. The first of those initiatives is the City Center District. Now, in the slides that we're going to show you, in the plan itself, each key initiative has several pages devoted to it. And in those pages, there are segments called Needed for Success and What and Why. And I've included in slides just different sections for different parts, because rather than take the time and the space to show you all of them for each one, you can see those in the plan itself. But in the City Center District, there were a couple of points in that initiative's Needed for Success segment that I wanted to sort of to bring out. And that is that, for example, in that first paragraph, zoning and site design standards, must be consistent with making it a place for people, not for traffic passing through. You're going to see a lot of things in this key initiative related to the creation of the Murray City downtown, and a lot of information and a lot of focus on pedestrian orientation and sort of the experience of the place being most important. One of the other things that the other initiative number 2, creating office and employment centers. I included the why and what sections for that one, so you can kind of see each initiative has its own presentation. But this one was an interesting one, and I wanted to include the why and the what because if you read through those 2 segments, you'll see that basically the consultants found us at 700% saturation for our retail markets. We do not lose any retail capability in the city. We don't lose retail to anybody else. We pull it in from everywhere around us. So the question is, how do we continue to grow our commercial areas and continue to keep up that status of collecting so much of the retail activity in the area? And their answer to that was that what we did lack a little bit was office and employment centers. Now we have offices and we have the IMC, which is a big employer, but that was an area where they felt like we could do more and we could improve. So they made that a focus, and we adopted initiative number 2 to create office and employment centers. The little map to the, see if I can get the pointer to work. Nope, that doesn't work, sorry. The map to the left here shows you you can see those orange dots. Those are key landmarks. You can see the old hospital, the old Cottonwood Hospital, or Tosh. It took me a long time after I started working here to stop calling it Cottonwood Hospital and call it Tosh. So you can be proud of me for a moment.
You had kids born there, right?
I had all of my kids born there except for, that lets you know how many kids I have. All of my kids except for 2 were born there. And you can see the center of town up north, and you can see the IMC as well. Those are kind of the 3 focal points, but then all of those hatched areas are areas where they identified us as being able to add more employment centers, add more office space. So that's where we've kind of focused our professional office district and things like that. And we'll talk about that more as we get into the plan as well. Just wanted to point out that there's opportunities that they've identified throughout the city for more office and more employment. And you can see that in the what and why statements. Now, of course, it has a needed for success statement too, but we only have so much time this afternoon to go through all of these things. Initiative 3, livable and vibrant neighborhoods. This is an interesting one, and I wanted to include the what statement because there is a statement here that I think is worth repeating. I'm just going to read that what statement. Neighborhoods that are proactively maintained will help homes keep or increase their market value. This can be achieved by buffering neighborhoods from incompatible uses. Locating small commercial nodes within walking or biking proximity to all neighborhoods allows for daily needs to be met without needing to drive to large commercial areas. Easy access to parks and trails contributes to the desirability of being in an area. And there's a map that goes with this initiative as well that shows the parks more clearly and kind of highlights those. So you can look at, just make a quick analysis and overview of every neighborhood's sort of accessibility to different shopping opportunities, to parks, et cetera. So this is trying to show that there's more to a neighborhood than just the houses that are in it. It's the access to things that helps make it livable as well. So that's initiative number 3. Initiative number 4, linking centers to surrounding context. What you're going to find in these statements is it seems fairly obvious at the outset, but Murray has a lot of different centers, like the area around the Tosh Hospital complex, and IMC, and Fashion Place Mall, and Wheeler Farm, and other kinds of places where people gather. And linking those together is what is lacking. So it calls out in the needed for success statement that consistent urban design, this is the 3rd paragraph, a consistent urban design theme with street lights, signage, and street trees would help create a visually coherent and cohesive area to link centers to surrounding context. They also, in this section, talk about the good example is the IMC itself. So the IMC is a big center, and so is the center, the downtown of Murray. We want it to become a bigger center than it is in redevelopment. And they've also, in that area, there have been hotels built, and those are good complementary uses to that IMC complex. It makes a lot of sense. And they're all well done, and the IMC is well done. However, the links between them are not great. It's not a pleasant place to walk, as was pointed out in several recent meetings. It's not a great area to be a pedestrian. That's what needs to get fixed. And so hence the initiative number 4, linking centers to their surrounding context. Something that we need to work on as we look at plans and projects in our city. And initiative 5 is a related topic, a city geared toward multimodality. Murray has a preponderance of really great corridors and transit opportunities and centrals, small nodes and central commercial areas that should all be linked better than they are. And we need to capitalize on that. And that mapping to the left there included in that initiative kind of shows you that. You have future community nodes that were identified, and we're going to talk about nodes as we go through the afternoon as well. And then you can see the different pathways, bike lanes that are current and bike lanes that are needed to help connect the city in ways other than just the automobile. We have a lot of opportunities to do it, and we should make the most of those. That's what that initiative is kind of calling out.
Jared?
Yeah.
I'm curious, how do you determine where you start? I mean, there's so much information, so many things that we need to, this indicates we should accomplish. Where do you start, and how do you
Yeah.
organize that?
That's a great question.
It just seems so,
There's a lot of things in it, and it doesn't get that level of so many things that could be done and so many opportunities that shouldn't be missed. That doesn't get less as you keep going through the plan. It just keeps building. There are so many things that we could do and so many things we should do. And that is the nature of the general plan. There are all these opportunities. You have to start somewhere. We started with, and we'll get into this later on too, but the short version of that question, the short answer to that question is we started with small area plans for our two largest, or two best opportunities of transit stations.
Which was the
Murray Central Station.
And the Passion Place West that was just adopted.
Yeah.
And another kind of a larger portion of that answer is we can finance or budget for and what we can accomplish with the staffing levels that we have. So those larger plans that really need a consultant to come in because they're so large, we've been able to get grants through Wasatch Front Regional Council. And we've accomplished some of those larger tasks because of that grant funding and a consultant being able to come in.
Right.
So is it largely budget driven?
A lot of it is budget driven, sure. And then as Melinda mentioned too, just bandwidth of staff. We don't have a large planning staff comparatively. So we spend a lot of time, the preponderance of our time is spent on current applications for things, processing questions. We get a lot of phone calls and emails every day. What we've kind of done is, when your house is a gigantic mess, I'm sure all of your houses are always clean, but mine sometimes is a gigantic mess, and you have to start somewhere. So I make the bed, because then it all seems possible once you've made the bed. In some ways, it's taken us a while to get it done, but we've made the bed. We've now adopted two good-sized small area plans. We need to seek other funding opportunities and identify the things that ought to be done first. Part of what we're doing now, what we're talking about today, is related to that. You're going to see as we go through this that a couple of the suggestions of the plan were that we look at mixed-use zones and how they should be applied in other parts of the city, and we're doing that now to the best of our ability with what we've got. We should do more of that and try to identify the things that make the most sense.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so
Diane, if I might.
Yeah.
And you might answer this on, later on in the presentation, but what has always been in the back of my mind as we have the general plan, is it business driven to when, and I'll use any of the zone changes, is it business driven when, like, RC Woolley is commercial, but that business plan no longer works? They're gone. So we adjust the general plan, or we try to adjust the general plan to fit the new business model or a future business model. So that's why in 2017 we have this. In 2021, things have changed, and that commercial business model no longer fits that particular piece of property. So that's what motivates. I assume that's what motivates.
Yeah.
So I guess, to make a long question longer, what do you guys look at when somebody comes in to with an application to change from what the general plan says, change the zone?
It's a great question. And we are going to talk about it later
Okay.
too. We can give you the short version of that now. We look at all of these different things that we're going to be going through. So you always start with, I like to think of it this way. When I'm talking to new planners, when they first start and they're just starting out their life as planners, we start with that map, the map that everybody knows. And it's as good a moment as any to say it. The general plan map, that future land use map that looks like a zoning map that we've looked at before, if you're just a person in the community and your connection to planning and zoning and the things that the city does is minimal, a lot of people think of that as the general plan. It is not. It's a single map in all of these statements, in all of these directions, in all of these goals and objectives. So we look at all of it. We generally do start with the map because it's the easiest thing to do. It's like the making the bed. You don't know how to consider the project because there's so many facets. You look at the map and see what it says, and then you dig deeper and start to look at the other things. But the short answer is we look at all of it, and it's kind of it's a little intensive, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, Jared brought up an example yesterday, which then I kind of adapted to a recent experience that Eric and I had in 2019. We had a general plan to go to Australia for vacation, and we had some items that we wanted to do and see while we were there. We got over there, there were fires, there were road closures, there were national park closures. So we did accomplish the general plan of getting to Australia, but I didn't get to go see the Blue Mountains. We stuck to the coastal areas because it was too smoky and fiery inlands. We had to go north for a period of time before, instead of going from Brisbane south to Sydney, because motorways, as they call them over there, were closed. So we still accomplished in general what our plan was, but we had to take different methods to get there. And Councilmember Cox, what you're talking about is really kind of why the general plan is designed to be flexible, why it's designed to be fluid, because there's always conditions that can change that would necessitate perhaps an amendment to the general plan, or that causes us to look at it and say, whereas 5 years ago when we were looking into our crystal ball, we thought this is what would happen, but we were wrong because nobody anticipated a global pandemic. That hastened a lot of the market changes that we have seen. So the general plan really is meant to be a document that can be changed and become fluid based on certain conditions. But again, it all filters back to those 5 key initiatives, where if someone does come and ask for a change, we say, okay, well, if our real goal is to get to Australia and we only get to New Zealand, is that going to get us there? And sometimes the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is, yeah, that's good enough. But we would look at that and say, okay, if the general plan wants us to support these 5 key initiatives, does this project, with the intent of that, then filter back up and still meet these key initiatives and the goals that are set for each of those initiatives? So we do have an example a little bit later on that we'll go through, but in general, that's kind of the theory behind the general plan.
Melinda, let me ask, it was brought to my attention a few days ago that and I'd never heard this, but I think you're going to agree with this now, and it's making sense, but someone had said to me that the general plan is a living document, and I'd never thought of it being like that. Is it worded in there all something about that in the general plan, that it's that type of a document?
It's not stated that directly, no, but all of the language, or lots of the language, and we have a slide about that a little later on too,
Okay.
alludes to the necessity to make adjustments to the plan outside of the 5 years and 10 years. We have an objective for the management of the plan that says in 5 years you ought to review how it's going and see if any big adjustments need to be made. And in 10 years you ought to have a new plan. So
State law requires that each municipality have a general plan, and it requires that general plan be done every 10 years, right? I think
you should have one.
I think the law requires that it has a review, a minimum of every 10 years. But the best practices is that in between those general plan years, you do a general plan update. So our
Yep.
the general plan from 2017, the plan that preceded that was from 2003.
Right.
Which that's a long time to go in between general plans. But so now that we're really 3-4 years away from having the 2017 general plan approved and adopted, we're really also looking at the time when we would take that 5-year look back and say, what has changed? What do we need to change in the general plan to account for that?
Well, that's good to know. Yeah.
If I could add to that, to your question too, the state land use code actually says that, and I'm reading this straight from the code, the general plan is an advisory guide for land use decisions, the impact of which shall be determined by ordinance. So, and then there is an exception to that, and that is public infrastructure has to comply to the general plan. But other than that, it's an advisory guide.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
One more question, then I won't ask any more.
You're fine.
That's why we're here.
By the time
That's what this is about.
it comes to the planning commission or to us, the infrastructure problems have all been taken care of. We know if we're voting on a zone change, we know that the infrastructure will handle that particular capacity of whatever that is.
Yes, at least preliminarily. Now, the details might
Well,
not
that's
all be
good.
there about, but we'll at least have it gets taken, any application, regardless of what it is, whether it's a conditional use or a zone change, like we're talking about, those get passed through different city departments and they all make comments. So engineering, public works, streets, fire, depending, Parks and Rec, or even the police department, we've been recently talking about expanding who we send them to depending on the nature of the application. But yeah, ostensibly it has been through reviews, at least preliminary cursory reviews with other departments. So we may not know all the details, but generally speaking too, bigger projects go through concept reviews as well. So they're doing their own background and work too. A lot of times the bigger and better projects will come to us already with environmental studies in place or having already done a cursory traffic analysis. We'd like to push people more that direction to make sure we get more projects that have already done that before we have to send them through that and move them on. And that's part of what we're anticipating in a way to respond to the current kind of concerns. So, yeah.
So part of the process, if you think back to the first slide where we said it started in 2014, wasn't adopted until 2017. That's a long time. But part of the process that we are going through during that time is we're sitting down with public works, with utilities, with engineering, and we're looking at the capacity that each of those utilities, the stormwater, water, storm or sewer, road capacity even, we're looking at those and saying, if there is an increase in density or a change in use, how does that impact the utilities? How does that work? Is the capacity there? And if the answer to those questions are no, then Public Works kind of goes through a separate process where they have their capital facilities plan and they would plan for. I know, I think what Ben Ford presented to you on Tuesday was their annual report for the sewer system, but they've also been working on their capital facilities plan. And Jared and I sat down with them last summer, and this is where we try and get out our crystal ball and say, you know, and we literally had this conversation where we said, we thought that some of these areas further away from State Street, further away from the transit, would be sustainable as commercial for longer periods of time. But based on everything that happened in 2020, our confidence level in those places being stable has declined. And so we want to look at those then as maybe changing to different uses, housing, multifamily housing. And so that's part of the work that's being done in the background with staff for the general plan. and what leads into that future land use map. But to directly answer your question, yes, every time a development project comes to us, we have a review that goes through all of the different departments. They each have an opportunity to comment on the project itself, the density, any concerns they would have, any access. And so in the Planning Commission staff report that we provide, there's a section that says staff comments. And that's where any of those comments that are received, they're added into that report, and we can make those conditions of approval if we need to. But essentially, if there was a project that were to come through and the utility capacity modeling would come back and say, you can't support this, then we would tell the applicant that it's not something that we could have a positive recommendation for with staff. And then we sort out kind of individually how that works. Do we need to get an infrastructure project in place? Does the developer want to pay for that? If the city doesn't have the financing to pay for it at that point in time. But we do those reviews. And I have also in the council action forms that we submit to you, I've also started including that staff report section in those, in the council action form. So you wouldn't have to dig through that to see what the staff comments are. And most of the time, those comments are, there's really not any concerns. So we do vet that.
So to echo what Dale says, so wouldn't be, and that's a good thing for us to know. It would not be presented to us with a positive recommendation if there were concerns with infrastructure, because sometimes that goes through, I won't speak for anybody else, but that goes through my head thinking, oh, for goodness sakes, you can't, we've got to be careful and da-da-da. But we need to be confident then when you recommend that you've already done your due diligence with infrastructure, and that you would never recommend a positive, you wouldn't recommend it if it wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, and most developers, then we would come back to them and we would say, look, the capacity just isn't there, regardless of what utility is. And let's just say water. Water is one of the easier utilities to provide capacity for because the lines are pressurized. You can easily engineer a solution to water issues as long as you have enough source available. That's more difficult with sewer because it's gravity fed, the lines are not pressurized. So to go back to a real example from last fall, or last summer really, the Howland project, 53rd and State Street, he applied for his general plan amendment and zone map amendment in July. And the comments that we got back in August included some concerns from the sewer department. And based on those concerns, we ended up taking the item off of the agenda and not moving it forward until we had an opportunity for the sewer division to do their modeling and see if capacity would be adequate to support the maximum zoning allowed there. So the modeling came back and showed that there was capacity. And that's when we allowed then, for lack of a better term, the Howland project to be back on an agenda in front of the Planning Commission. So that's essentially how it would work. And most developers would want to take a step back and not process an application that wouldn't have a positive recommendation from staff.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
So I think I understand the way that staff looks at different proposals or applications and making sure that our utilities can handle the load. What about, so the general plan helps them plan ahead, right, of like where development could happen, to what extent, to what volume. But if we've had such a high volume of applications all at the same time, are those looked at individually? Or I'm kind of thinking like, if we have 6 mixed use applications all at the same time, and all of those are going to put a different kind of strain, is it looked at comprehensively or is it looked at project by project? I'm just kind of worried about that a cumulative effect.
Yeah, so again, a really good question. And we look at them individually. So timing wise, it was weird that the Howland general plan amendment and rezone actually came before the council after the sports mall and the RC Willey site, which their application came in, I think, the end of October and November. But we had already looked at the sewer capacity for the Howland one. We went back, and at least with the sports mall, that is in a different, that's in the Jordan Valley sewer district, right?
It's in Cottonwood sewer district.
Cottonwood Improvement Sewer District. So we also last year, it was last year, Jared and I sat down with the engineering staff for Cottonwood Improvement Sewer District to help them understand what we envision changing from 9th East above, so that they can plan for their capital facilities. So we did that with our own internal Murray City Sewer Division, but now we're doing that too with the other entity that serves our residents. So in that case, we send the information to the sewer district, they look at it. We do evaluate each site independently. And that's important because of how the sewer system is set up. There are areas in the city that don't have any capacity issues. And even there's areas in, let's say, the northeast quadrant that have less sewer capacities than what's in the southeast quadrant. And sewer capacity east of State Street is limited. It's not as limited on the west side of State Street. And hopefully Danny and Ben and Trey would agree that I just stated that accurately. But that's what we look at. And we look at each site individually, because even though there may be capacity at one site, it may be different at another site because of a grade change, the existing lines that are there, how dense an area is. So we do have to look specifically at each of the sites when they come to us.
Okay.
I had a question.
Okay.
And I know we talked about this a little bit more specifically when I met with Melinda and Jared, is the capacity of how much we can grow in certain areas of the city in terms of our infrastructure, and also how, in terms of traffic, we don't look at that. We don't look at how that would increase traffic within our areas. And maybe I'm wrong in stating that, Melinda, but that's not something that we look at specifically. Is that correct?
No, I would say that's not. We do have that consideration taken. That's one of the primary roles that Trey has, is to look at the impacts to traffic. He has the ability through code to essentially require a traffic impact study be done anytime there's a development. But there's a threshold that kind of, if you're in the business, you kind of know that, anything less than, let's say, 100 units, or is it 80?
So 100 units or 30 lots.
30
generally.
lots is not enough to really impact enough to warrant a traffic study. But that's something that we do work with Public Works and Engineering.
But could you explain? I mean, I guess what I understood from that meeting is that we're not looking at as specifically. Hold on a second. We're not looking at it specifically in a certain way that the public sees it. So,
well, I think that,
we kind of went into detail. So I kind of came out of that meeting thinking it's not something that we necessarily look at if let's say State Street, for example, because it's a state-owned highway or, a state-owned street, that we're not looking at it that specifically.
Well, I guess in some ways with State Street and 34,000 cars a day, in some ways, no, it's hard to impact 34,000 cars a day. However, State Street, I think what you're probably remembering from the meeting, Rosalba, maybe, is that State Street's is UDOT controlled. And so while we don't sort of abdicate our responsibility to review that or consider it, any project has to be, and even a zone change gets a review from UDOT for access management, because they are very concerned about how much traffic gets put out from different projects onto State Street, and not so much how much, but where it comes out. So it's more an access management question with a facility like State Street. But yeah, we still have to look at that.
Well, and a couple other things. The city also has what's called a master transportation plan. And right now, one of the big projects that Trey has been working on for the last year is an update to that master transportation plan. That also comes into play when we look at new development or redevelopment and how that plan would be implemented. I'm not sure. Jared's been on the committee for that plan, for coordinating with Public Works on that, but eventually that plan will come to the city council for approval, and there will be a recommendation in there for levels of service. And I know you've heard Trey talk about levels of service and intersections. There's, and again, I'm not a traffic engineer, I'm not an engineer, but there are certain levels of service that come along with different levels of traffic impact. So when there is a lot of additional impact, a service level of an intersection may drop from an A to a B, or a B to a C, and there's levels A through F. I don't want to get too much into the details with that, but part of what we would like to do going forward to address some of those concerns is work with Public Works to establish a standard that we would incorporate into our ordinances that says a traffic level, at an intersection. I'm just going to give an example. We won't allow for a level of service drop more than one level without mitigating the impacts. And then the traffic impact study, most people think that a traffic impact study is going to come back and say, don't do the project. And that's never going to be the case. It's going to come back and say, if the project is done, here are the impacts, and here's how you mitigate those impacts. And so that's where you go and you widen a road, or you add additional stop signs, or you put in left-hand turn signals because there's additional capacity, or you may have to widen an intersection too and add different through lanes. So there's also another planning document that comes into play as well. But Trey really is the one who keeps an eye on that, and he's super intelligent about the traffic. I don't think he is a traffic engineer per se, but he's very, very knowledgeable about that.
He's digested thousands of them over the years.
Yeah. He could probably write a traffic impact study in his sleep.
No doubt.
So I think, to go back to your question, Councilmember Dominguez, I think that the difference is that there's a level of knowledge and expertise and understanding of like what an actual impact is, meaning a level of service drop versus perceived impacts, or that a lot of people are under the impression that an apartment complex is going to produce far more trips than a single family development. And traffic studies have come back and shown that typically the mixed use developments, the multifamily developments generate fewer trips than single family residential does. So some of it's counterintuitive, but to answer your question, that's really something that that Trey pays a lot of attention to. And I would say he's pretty passionate about it too, trying to keep those. And then we do also, like I said, we have to coordinate with Cottonwood Improvement District. We would also then, Trey has the privilege of coordinating with UDOT on any of those impacts. So we do pay attention to that. we do have to coordinate with UDOT. And I think even UDOT has a standard of, if it's so many units, you have to do a level 1 traffic analysis. A level 2 is, a medium-sized development. A level 3 is a very large development. And based on what the impacts or what the perceived impacts would be is how in depth you go to those traffic studies.
Okay, any other questions? Kat, Rosalba? I don't want to leave you out, so just speak up, please.
I'll insert ourselves, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll jump in. We're good.
Good, good.
Thank you.
All right. I'll share my screen again if that's okay.
Thank you.
And this should be where we were.
That was a great discussion, by the way.
Really helpful for us.
No, they're good, and they're good questions. So keep them coming, no problem, and we'll keep going through things.
I know, and if we don't hit every one of our agenda items, which we may not, we will continue. We'll do this again.
Sounds good.
Really
I talk about it in my free time for fun. Just ask my kids, so it's no problem. It's fun for me anyway, not so much for them. Why is that not going? Okay, there we go. So we mentioned as we were starting to talk about that part 1 that when we were generating the general plan or producing the general plan, we wanted to identify these small area plan projects or these small area planning projects. That found its way into part 1, and this is the map that identifies them. And I think Melinda mentioned we gave you a copy as well of these small area plan projects. And there are a lot of them, as Diane, you pointed out. There's so much stuff to do, and this is just small area plans. There are other mentions of things we ought to look into, things we ought to identify as you go through the sort of the fine print of the general plan. These big things were kind of where we thought we had to start, small area plans. And you can see there's regional centers and community centers, neighborhood centers and nodes, rail transit oriented and bus rapid transit village nodes. When this map was put into place, for example, just to point out a time when we probably need to make an adjustment. When this map was put into place, you can see bus rapid transit village nodes. It says located at major intersections along State Street down at the bottom. We're actually going to, since this plan was put in place, there's a Mid-Valley bus rapid transit coming as well. That's not featured here on the map. It's in our new master transportation plan that the Public Works Department is working through right now, but it wasn't on our radar for this. So that'll need to get updated. And we'll want to do small area plans and along that route as well, probably. We don't have a large portion of that BRT, but it does cut through a significant part of our city along 5th West, 500 West, 700 West, Riverside Drive, Murray Boulevard, whatever it's called at whatever part you're on. So,
well, I pointed out earlier when Jared and I were doing a dry run of the slides, you'll notice down in that corner where RC Willie was, that is noted as a neighborhood
city retail center
or city retail center. And I posed the question, would that, now the RC Willie is gone, would we still classify that as a city retail center? And I don't really know the answer to that question, but that's certainly something that we would ask ourselves and something that we would look at going forward without having that kind of major anchor store or a destination store of RC Willie there anymore. Would we consider that to be a city retail center? And I think probably the answer would be no, but we'd want to evaluate the criteria that are established to classify those areas as those type of centers. And, that's something that obviously 3-4 years ago, none of us contemplated that RC Willie would be closing.
Good point. Thank you. So those are the small area planning projects, and that's kind of the last thing that's in part 1 of the general plan. So we move on from there to part 2, which, as I mentioned, was the part that was intended for use by the city staff and by the city officials when they evaluate proposals and policy changes. That's not to say that we don't consider the things from part 1. Part 2 was more specifically designed to make that easier to quote, snip, put in general plan or in project reviews, etc. There are elements in that second part They include land use and urban design, transportation systems, economic development, housing and neighborhoods, moderate income housing, public services, and plan administration and implementation. Go ahead.
So we were asked earlier, is there language in the general plan that indicates that it's a living document? And that may not be an exact quote, but this bolded section up there where it says in quotations, evaluate proposals and policy changes, that is taken directly from the general plan. So that does then infer that we would anticipate that there would be some changes. And it provides to us the criteria that we want to look at as we go forward and issue a recommendation that then we put down in a staff report.
Great. And I was going to mention too, that public services section, there are subsections of that. That's where you have parks and recreation and facilities, streets and water facilities, sewer facilities, things like that. So there's some information in the general plan goals about those things. I should have had that at parks. I'm going to tell you what they are. Just it ought to be in your slide. Parks, trails, and open space, nature and environment and infrastructure and resilience, community, culture, and historic preservation. Those are all part of that public services. This is, well, that's several pages, but it's, the page I'm looking at is page, well, it's in the second section, so it's page 5, if you're counting it that way.
Section 2, page 5.
Yeah, well, it's the opening page of section 2, so it doesn't really have a page number. Page 5.1. When you get into those, it's just item 10, and then it has 10.1, 10.2, 10.3 of those 3 subsections. Should have had that in there. Sorry about that. So those are the elements of the general plan. Now, each of those elements has a chapter. So they're listed as chapter. The first one is chapter 5. And they're presented in each chapter has a certain structure to it. And they're presented in 3 sections. The first section is labeled what we know. Second section is labeled how does that help us plan for the future? And the third is the goals, the goal for the chapter, the objectives, and the strategies. So let me just briefly show you a little bit about that. What we know is a section that gives you basically data. It provides information and data that would be helpful in looking at that kind of element and how you evaluate a project or a change or something else that has to do with that element. The second section is usually the smallest one, and it's basically a segue or a series of takeaways from that data that then leads you to the objectives. So it's setting you up to say, here's what's important about that for the future, and then the third step is the goal and the objectives and strategies that help you respond basically to that data that we've looked at. That's the basic structure, and you have to remember too that those objectives and strategies, as we look at them, as Councilmember Cox asked earlier, what do we look at when we get asked about a change? When we get asked about a project or receive an application that has to do with anything significant, or we get a request for a change to anything, a text amendment, a zone change, a general plan amendment, we want to look at how those objectives and strategies are supporting those initiatives that we talked about, the first 5 initiatives. And if that request is supported by these statements or lends support to those statements, or if it's contrary to those. That's basically what we want to do. And
That's helpful, Jared.
yeah, you bet. And there's a section that back in that first part, those key initiatives all have the last page of the key initiative of each one, and I'll show you a slide here in a moment that shows this, has the key initiative in the middle, and then each one of the elements to the side with all of the objectives from that element that support that initiative feeding into it. So you can really easily kind of look at that and say, well, we'll look at it here in a minute. It'll make more sense visually.
And if I can, I think that I think all of us in the planning division and CED would say that the general plan is a working document for us. And that's where if you were to go back and compare this 2017 plan to the 2003 plan, it's going to be a totally different type of plan, because really I think in the mid 2000s is when the adaptation of a general plan really got to the point where, no, we want to have these goals and objectives, and we want to have strategies on how to get us there, so that it's a plan that actually can be implemented and used in a community versus just one that sits on a shelf. And so honestly, Jared's general plan is pretty much always out on his desk. Anytime there's a question, somebody comes to the counter, there's a phone call before a meeting or even in a meeting, we're referring back to this general plan.
And mine can't be used for photocopies for public either, because there's a lot of weird notes in it too. So that's how it goes. It is very much a working document. That's a good way to think about it.
I have a question because it goes back to what the mayor's statement was about the statute.
Yeah.
So if it's something that we do refer to in your department, but it's just kind of what was it you said, Mayor?
An advisory document, I believe.
An advisory document. But for the council, and this is just how I've seen it, and it could be different than the other council members, is we are obligated to our code as well as our general plan. And that's how I've looked at it, as and those being living documents, right? That they do change, they do they can change, and they flow and ebb and flow in terms of our community and our constituents that we serve.
Yeah.
So I just want to understand, is it something that you keep referencing, or is it something that you just kind of use as a guideline per se? Because I feel like there's two contradicting ways that you look at this document that I'm receiving, or I'm trying to understand here.
I think we kind of do both of what you're saying. We refer to it, but as an advisory document. So there's not a lot in it that's going to tell you, it's not the general plan and the zoning ordinance, for example, are very much to each other as the design guidelines that we talked about recently are to development standards. So guidelines are advisory, and they're supposed to inform your decisions, but they don't give you hard lines that say you can't. The zoning code, for example, is full of setbacks that are 20 feet. There's no range there. There's no margin of error. In the guidelines or in the general plan, it'll say things like, and I if I was faster, I'd go back to a point in it, but it'll say things like, in this neighborhood commercial zone that you should create, for example, one of the things we haven't done yet that we ought to, in this neighborhood commercial zone that you should create, consider setbacks that are closer to the street, so you don't create large parking areas between people that are walking and the buildings. But it doesn't tell you, like our zoning code would, have those setbacks be no more than 0 to 7 feet or 0 to 10 feet. So that's really the difference. So we refer to it a lot and we work with it a lot, but in an advisory capacity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. I guess it's just the language is kind of, it's this, but it's not this. So it just depends on what you guys are referencing. So I feel like sometimes the argument can be, it is advisory, but then we don't have to reference it. So I'm trying to understand that.
Yeah, I think we should always reference it. I think that, and this is maybe, well, I'll go ahead and say it this way. There is enough room in the language of a plan like a general plan that you could form two different opinions. Two different people could form two different opinions about what it says and whether something is appropriate or not. And that is just a necessary pitfall of anything that's going to be broad enough to be advisory and not inhibit your ability to plan in your city. Does that make sense? That is the case. You can find lots of things. For example, in this plan, let's say that we have a proposal to do something. We might find 18 points where that planned change is supported by this general plan. There still might be 3 that can easily feel like they're not supported. Those 3, the question is whether you let those 3 things that don't support it be overwhelmed by the others, or whether you feel like they're more important than the others. The argument has to be made. So you can't reference it as simply as a zoning code and say, plan says no. Zoning code says 20 feet. I'm sorry, your setback is 15. You're going to have to adjust that. The general plan doesn't work that way. You're going to have to make your arguments and hope that you're making the right ones and that everyone agrees with you. It's a consensus kind of a document. You're going to be able to find things in it that don't agree with some of the things that they're going to be contradicting statements in it. There just are. It's too broad of a document not to have those, and too complicated of a subject in land use to not have those contradictions. So I think that's kind of where it gets confusing. Yeah.
Well, and I just wanted to clarify that too, because I think what happens is we get asked a lot, Well, but it's in the general plan. It's in the general plan. And, being something that we've studied and that we are doing this workshop now to better understand it, is how much of it do we then say, okay, yes, we have this document, but it's open to interpretation. And depending on what we get as a recommendation from economic and development, then we'll base our decision on that.
Uh-huh.
And that can be for anybody, any developer too, right? They can take the general plan and say, hey, I'm going to apply, but it's kind of open to interpretation and it can go any way depending on your guys' leadership in this and what the staff recommends. And then we then have to decipher, okay, we're going to take your recommendation and move our decision to be this. Or if we have questions about X, Y, and Z, how does that come into play too? So there's just a lot of kind of vagueness. And I think what I'm getting a lot too is citizens just kind of want a little bit more for it to be a little bit more concrete.
So,
and how much of it is and isn't.
So a couple of things that I think may be helpful to the public, but also to all of us to understand is the changes, the general plan amendments that have come forward have been the ones that we vet and say, yes, we feel like this is something that the general plan can support. And staff then, Jared and I actually had a conversation within the last couple of months, and his comments to me were, I cannot look at the city's general plan and support this ethically. I would not be a good planner. I would not be fulfilling my role. So then we get back to an applicant or somebody who's calling us and asking us questions, and we say, look, this is something that we don't feel like fits into the general plan. Now, at the end of the day, it's still their choice if they want to submit an application to us, and we can bring a proposal to the Planning Commission and then to you with a negative staff recommendation. But most people don't see the sense in doing that. And so I think there is a sentiment that the applications that come before the Planning Commission or the City Council, decisions are already made. Staff always supports everything that comes to them. And to a large extent, actually, that's true, because we do, and I shouldn't say we, really my staff, Jared, Zach, Susan, they do an excellent job of helping a possible applicant understand how that essentially would be time wasted and money wasted because it's not something that fits into the general plan. So there's several concepts or ideas that come to us each week that never get before the Planning Commission, never even get before a planning review committee or even an individual meeting with the planners, because it's just not something that would be supported based on this. Jared also, when we get in a few slides, we'll start talking about the future land use map. But I think oftentimes people look at the future land use map, and that is the most common thing that is put in front of them. And therefore that becomes kind of the one-stop shop for, does it fit the general plan? And that map is just one page out of 172 pages, I think. And so there have been, and we have some data to show you as well about general plan amendments and zone map amendments that other cities in Utah are doing. There are some cities that have chosen to move away from even having a future land use designation map because it's very confusing to the public, because they see that map and feel like that's the map that shouldn't change. When again, and the dialogue that we're having today is, how do we look at those other 172 pages and feed that into the 5 key initiatives? And then how does that then inform any changes that we would want to make on that future land use map to change a color that's on a certain section of the city.
That's a good characterization of exactly how that works. I think as I was listening to Melinda talk about it, Councilmember Dominguez, I hear something in that I think relates to what you're saying really directly. That the map has, at the risk of sounding oversimplistic, the map has lines and colors. And it's really, that's like the concrete stuff that you're talking about. That's unambiguous. This parcel is labeled X. So how can you say then that this could change, or that we could consider something different? And the answer is you have to look at all these other things too. And that can feel a little less than satisfying. It can feel a little self-serving. And I get that. And we're guilty as staff to a certain degree, at least, of utilizing the map that way when we get really crazy proposals for things and people want to do the craziest things. You have no idea, because you'll never see those. But we have a tendency to use that map and be a little quick to just dismiss what's being proposed by saying, look, the map says no, so we're not talking about it anymore. We could go further into it and saying there's this objective and this objective and this objective that also would continue to say no. So we're not even going to talk about changing the map. We kind of stop at that point and say, we're not going to talk about changing the map because just no. We shouldn't do that, probably. It creates a kind of a culture of that perpetuates that difference, where that creates that difference between what's hard and unambiguous in the plan and what is less so. When really the map, even though it looks less ambiguous, is no more concrete than the objectives. It really isn't. It just appears that way because visually it's a map and people gravitate to that. So I think Melinda's right. As we start looking at that and we show you the objectives and talk about those a little bit, it might make a little more sense why we view it the way we do as a working document. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate that. I just wanted a little bit more of an explanation on your guys' part.
Great.
To better understand the position and also the role within the document. And I think that's important for me to understand, to let constituents know as well.
Yeah, that's
Thank
great.
you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And hopefully I get the right one to back where we were. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the what we know, the how does that help us plan, and the goals and objectives. Let me go through a couple of things. What I'm going to do next is, we mentioned there are a whole bunch of these different elements, right? I can't remember now how many there are. 11 different elements. No, there's not. There's less than that. But anyway, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 are the elements. We can't really go through all of those unless we want to continue this for several days or a week or so. So we thought we'd focus on chapter 5. That's the first of the elements. It's land use and urban design. And it has a couple of interesting things that, in addition to the regular stuff that's in all the others, that we thought might be most sort of accessible and most interesting to you. So we're using that as an example. So in chapter 5, this first example is from the land use and urban form section. That's chapter 5. You're going to see that at the top of each slide. And it's from the first section, the what we know section. And there's a lot more than just these two things in there. There's pages of this. And they're all great to look at if you're feeling up to it one day. Take a look at all the different maps and things that are in there. But it's basically, like we mentioned, data. So that pie chart there is the existing land use distribution, or at least the existing land use distribution in 2016 when we were in the midst of this project. And then to the right is a little map that's related to that. Sort of, you can see that big light blue section over here. The vast majority of our land, 46% of our existing land use in the city, that's not zoning. Zoning's a little higher actually as a percentage. But the land use, 46% of the land is used for single family residential. And then you can look at that little map section to the right and kind of see visually how that works. So, and there's a map like that in this data section for each of the land use categories that you see in the pie chart. So you can look at our commercial sections and see that acreage kind of visually represented. And you can look at the multifamily and see it visually represented. Interestingly enough, in 2016, our percentage of residential mixed use was small enough as a land use, not as a zoning category, but as a land use, that it didn't register in the percentages. It's more than that now, but it was not much in 2016.
No, I want to make a distinction though. That's residential mixed use, not the mixed use zone.
Yeah, sorry. Not the MU zone, yeah.
Yes. So that would be, where's an example of that in the city?
You know, I couldn't tell you one off the top of my head.
Okay. So I just wanted to make a distinction. That's not we're not saying that less than 1% is mixed use. That's a distinct category of residential mixed use.
Right.
So 46% of the land in Murray is single family residential, and 9% in
Is multi.
2017 is multifamily residential.
Yep. And then you can see kind of here too, this is an interesting point. And the reason that data is an important part of the general plan is because it informs the kind of things that we implement as objectives. So we have a lot of land, 12% and 8%, either as parks and open space or as public and quasi-public uses. So that's where you're going to see big institutions and things like that. They're on land in Murray that aren't necessarily private land or zoned in some other way. And a lot of parks and open space too.
If you want to refer back to that in your notes, that's page 55 of the general plan. So if you want to go and look like an actual full-size page of that land distribution later on.
Which I recommend. It's very fun. There's a lot of good stuff in that data section of these. This second slide is the second section of the.
Quick question,
Yeah.
going back to that land use, where would we be in percentage of commercial and retail? If, let's say we approved what we have in front of us after this memorandum. Would that decrease it like by 5%?
Well, I don't think it would. I don't think it would necessarily decrease it at all, because we typically, and I don't know, off the top of my head, I'm going to admit to you that I don't know if that residential mixed use portion there is mixed use as we view it. Because remember, this isn't zoning, this is land use. So this is actual parcels and acreage in use. That residential mixed use might actually be referring to, at the time we had like Cooper Knowlton's project or Mike Brodsky's old project with a couple of offices underneath that in the center court apartments. So not a huge mixed use land use category. That we typically as staff and the city, we look at mixed use zoning as a commercial zone and a commercial use that has residential components added to it. That might seem backward given the numbers of units that get put in with commercial mixed use projects, but I don't know that number would go down at all, Rosab, and I don't know what it would be. I'd have to get data from a consultant to do that. Or
Okay,
look at more data
thank you.
than I have.
I
Yeah.
think GIS might be able to help us with that.
They could.
So
They could probably
we'll
do
look
that.
at getting some data from GIS about the percentages of land and zoning updated.
Yeah, that's a great thought. And our office percentage is probably rising a little bit too. And industrial is probably shrinking a little bit. That chart would be interesting to update for that 5-year update of the plan that we're talking about. Good question. Thank you. The second slide here, this next slide is about that, is from the second section of the element, the how does it help us plan for the future? So like I mentioned, this is kind of where they take the big takeaways from that data and say, well, here's how it ought to inform what objectives we have. What they did was create this framework map. And that shows you, as you can see in the legend, it shows you stable neighborhoods, it shows you transit stations, it shows the historic district, regional centers, and those nodes that we've been talking about throughout. And this is where they first really bring forth the idea of the nodes and say, look, in our general plan, in addition to just land use categories and other statements like that, so like we mentioned in talking before, the land use categories are applied to properties, and those properties have edges, and it's all very clean. The nodes are not so clean. The nodes are placed on the map, and they make it into the 5.7 map that we're going to look at soon here, because they don't align with certain properties' boundaries. They're placed to say in this area, as it says, I think right here, the paragraph at the bottom before the indented language. The planned location of these nodes supports the city's long-term goal of emphasizing growth within the city center and transit-oriented development areas, and focusing new job and housing options in identified transit corridors, transit station areas, community centers and nodes, neighborhood centers and nodes. The specific characteristics of each node will be based on the surrounding context and future area-specific small area plans. We don't have any of those yet for these nodes, but if you look at the language at the top, that's worthy of reading too. The future land use map and policies in the general plan, part 1, key initiatives identify specific areas of Murray that are planned to accommodate a more flexible mix of uses where job and housing growth can occur as an effort to both provide amenities to surrounding residential neighborhoods and to stabilize those neighborhoods by preventing unplanned creep and growth. And then it identifies community nodes and neighborhood nodes. So they wanted to say in this, I remember the consultants talking about it, saying the nodes are supposed to tell you that you have the land use designations on the map here, but where the nodes are, you need to be more flexible about what's going to happen. Because these are areas where, in order to stabilize a neighborhood, you may need to add things that will make people want to stay long-term or make them able to stay long-term with different housing choices, et cetera. So that is what we were talking about here. The nodes that are identified get described in this section, and they make it on to that future land use map as a feature. And that's in this slide here. So this is still from that section 2. They provide the 5.7 future land use map and say every property in the city, every parcel in the city is going to get put into one of these categories. But then you can also see, and I can't really zoom in to show you, but you can also see those nodes identified where these are areas where you should expect change, basically. And we should look at those areas carefully. We ought to do it with plans. It's hard to get the funding and the staff time to do those, but we ought to be trying to do that. So,
And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, this is really where, like this information that you see here on this future land use map is staff looking into a crystal ball. It's us trying to be prophetic about what the future will bring. And I know Jared has told me that there was several conversations of dialogue back and forth about when certain areas would become more subjected to change. And, you know, when would some of those developments on State Street, like the Shopco, like how sustainable is a large big box like that? I know they had conversations, I wasn't here at that time, but I know according to Jared, they had conversations about, you know, we would anticipate that these areas up on 9th East, where the sports mall is, where EOS is there now, the old sports castle. Okay. So that Sports Authority. So we look at those areas, and this is what we're doing now back in 2015, right? We're looking at this map and saying, what use do we think these properties or these areas will have in the next 5-10 years? So we're looking at long range planning. And this is where nobody predicted a pandemic. Nobody predicted so many market changes. And nobody predicted some of the things that have happened since 2015. But that's where we look at, there really wasn't a lot of changes to the areas of stability of the city, which is that 46% of the land that's zoned in single family residential. That's the strongest part of Murray. That is the part of Murray that we don't consider to be subjected to future changes. That's really the stability of the entire city. It's the other areas that are more volatile and open to transition. So when we look at these areas and we know, okay, this area still, we think this is going to stay manufacturing. We don't really consider that will change. In fact, one of the items that came to us in the last 6 or 8 months was to rezone some of the area in the northwest part of the city, up above 45th South and east or west of the I-15 to mixed use or to some type of a higher density residential. And we didn't feel like that would be a project that would be supported by the general plan. We also didn't feel like it would fit in well with the surrounding uses of the land and what the long-term uses of those lands, what we would predict them to be. So that future land use map really is our best guess as staff as to what the future will bring. And I think in a lot of cases, we found ourselves last summer, last fall, really kind of scratching our heads and saying, well, we didn't get this right because they're coming to us now, we thought that maybe would have been more of like the 10-year plan, the 10-year outlook from the 2017 plan. But again, we're talking about conversations that were held back in 2015, 2016, before the plan was actually then adopted by the council in 2017.
Good point. Thank you. So,
Well, I have a question about that. If I get that we, of course, we have to ebb and flow with the general plan, but there's some things that weren't in place or are in place for something so big to happen right now, like impact fees, that we didn't consider because we thought we were going to be 10 years out, or right? So with that being said, I'm glad for the memorandum, but those are some things that we should be looking at as well when we do make these changes. I mean, shouldn't it be something that we look at when we do make these changes, when we do some major land use changes?
I've meant actually to follow up with Kim Sorensen and tell him I thought he did an excellent job on Tuesday presenting the park impact fee information to you. And that's really something that, I guess, in my opinion, those impact fees really help support new development and the impacts that brings. And whether that's to parks, there's some cities that have police and fire impact fees. I don't want to speak for another department and say whether or not I think they should or shouldn't, but I do think that is a really good thing to look at and consider. And it's one of the ways that you can have the new growth pay for those impacts versus looking to general fund revenue. But it is quite a process to go through to get all of those impact fees in place. And there's a lot of studies you have to do to get those in place. I think that, one of the things that I had heard was that it was, at least the dialogue I've had with Kim about the park impact fees, is that was something that was looked at several years ago, but the growth rate of Murray has traditionally been very slow and controlled apart from our annexation. And so with that mindset, if you're looking at, you get 100, maybe you only get 100 new residents a year, or 150, when you put that in perspective of Harriman or Saratoga Springs, that is, that they're literally issuing certificates of occupancy in 100 new single family dwellings per month, which is mind blowing to think. But you think of that where they may have 1,200 new residents a year. Does it make sense for Murray to put those fees in place if there's only 150 or 100 per year? But I think over the years, that does add up. And when you look at, then can you go back, and as Kim was mentioning on Tuesday, you could add in other pocket parks, or you could add additional equipment to an existing park, or make additions to some of the infrastructure that you have, as long as it's in your plan. So, I think it's something that is worthwhile considering. And if the other departments are open to that, I think that really helps alleviate some of the concerns that you would have as a city council, or that citizens would have, when the perception is that, developers come in, it impacts all of these items, and we have to pay for it. And that's precisely what the impact fees are for. So with the streets impact fees, you would have a number of projects outlined, and you would know these are the areas that we anticipate impacts. And so the funding that would come in from those impact fees could go to pay for right-of-way acquisition or intersection improvements, as long as that's what you have in your plan and what's anticipated in the plan. So I think it's something good to consider.
Thank you.
Okay, just moving on from the future land use map to talk a little bit more about them, or about the designations. I did want to get into this a little bit because it's right after looking at the designation on the map, the next stopping point in considering anything when you're looking at the general plan and trying to determine if it's good or not, or if it meets the plan or supports the plan or is against the plan, is to look at the designation. And each designation has a description and kind of an intent statement, and then it has a density range if it's a residential designation, and it has zones that are called out that are appropriate for that area or for that designation. So, for example, in the future land use categories, you have 13 of them: parks and open space, low density residential, which we've shown on the left here. We can talk about in just a moment. Medium density residential also. Higher density residential, mixed use, residential business, neighborhood commercial, city center, general commercial, professional office, business park, industrial, and industrial. And we have a couple of examples, starting with low density residential and medium density residential. In the plan, when we implemented the 2017 general plan, we simplified the categories a bit. There used to be many more categories. We're down to 13. I think there were 20 some odd in the previous plan, but it called out low density single family detached residential, medium density single family detached residential, high density single family detached residential, and then did the same exact thing for multifamily as well. We felt like that was fairly redundant, and we simplified the categories moving forward. But in doing so, you have these different categories called out. You also notice, this is an interesting point, I think, A1 agricultural is listed as a corresponding zone in the low density residential category. That's because there is no agriculture category anymore. There used to be, there's not one anymore. Everything that was agriculture was placed in that low density residential category, and parks and open space became its own category instead of being lumped in with agriculture. It felt like it was time to do that in 2017.
Well, and then too, with number 5 and the temporary land use regulation that you put in place on February 2nd, it gets a little bit confusing because we have the mixed use zone, but the mixed use zone itself falls under the future land use category of mixed use. And the 3 zones that are listed under that category is the mixed use zone, it's the MCCD and the TOD zone. Yeah. So there's kind of these umbrella categories that then these individual zones fall within that.
And then and actually on the next slide we can talk about that a little bit. I've listed that as well, and so we can get a little further into that if you have any questions about it. But then medium density residential, I failed to mention here. The density range, you see that here on low density residential, between 1 and 8 dwelling units per acre. And then on the density range between 6 and 15 in medium density residential. And you can see that those overlap. That's not an accident. That's kind of that's the thinking that was embraced, is that there is that sort of gray area between the two where it's the higher end of low density residential, but it's not quite medium, and they do overlap a bit. And as a result of that, the R16 is placed in both categories. And that's really the reason that it's there.
Okay.
I know that's another agenda item, but I just wanted to point it out now.
That's good. We can deal with it now, actually.
That's the reason that it's in both, because the densities that are generated by an R16 subdivision are about 7 units to the acre. And it's right in there, in both, between the 6 and 15 and between the 3 and 8.
Yeah, and it also gets a little bit confusing too, because the single family residential zones are primarily named after a square footage amount that's required for a minimum lot.
Right.
But you would think R16, it would be easy to think, well, that means 6 units per acre.
6 units per acre, but
it's not. It's a 6,000 square foot lot. And R18 is a minimum 8,000 square foot lot.
Right.
10,000, 12,000. So
yeah. So
it can be the nuances of all of this can be very confusing, and I'll say this too, each city does it their own way. I sat on a panel last year with the Utah Land Use Institute, and we were talking about it was when all of the regulation was being put in place for the medical cannabis. And somebody in the audience said something about, well, you just need to tell the state that it would be allowed in these types of zones. And one of the attorneys in the room said, you can't say that because every city lists their land use in different ways. And so it would be intuitive to look at that and think, oh, R16, 6 lots or 6 units to the acre, but it's not. Although in another community, it may be listed that way.
Yeah, perfect. And then our multifamily, just to make it more
Even
confusing,
more confusing.
our multifamily zones are labeled RM7 or sorry, RM10 and RM15 typically, but the RM10 zone gets you 7 units to the acre, almost exactly what you would get out of a single family R16 subdivision if you were able to make all of them just 6,000 square feet. That's the base density, and then you have to do things to get to the 10 units per acre. Same with RM15, it's 12 units to the acre, which is a very typical sort of townhome density. 12 units to the acre, you have to do extra things to get 13 and 14 and 15. And the number of people who've done it are 0 people, one or two people over the course of the years that it's been in place. For me, 1 person since I've been here.
Okay, well, I'm going to cross off number 2 then.
Okay. If that. Oh yeah.
We're glad you explained that because we thought that meant 10 to 15 kids for RM per family.
Yes. Well, that's just in my part of the world.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jared, we'd know that.
The R stands for residential. The 1 stands for essentially single family.
Yeah.
And then with the R and the M, it's residential multifamily, which could mean a townhome. It could mean a duplex.
Right.
It could mean a quadplex.
Yeah. It could mean all kinds of anything.
So some of it can get a little intuitive if you know the terminology, but it also is misleading too, because you would think if for the multifamily, if you're going to yield 12 units to an acre, why are you calling it RM15?
No, we should probably
that was
rename
done
it.
before we both worked here. We could say that.
I
But
worked here long enough to fix that though, but it's a lot of work to fix that.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes,
It's
So-
a little confusing.
it is confusing.
I know.
Hey, Jared, what do you mean it's a lot of work? Like, explain that to me. If we were
well,
to fix it, like, what would we have to do?
Hire 2 more planners.
Well, I don't know about that, but the problem is that every time we talk about fixing it, we come back to the same issue. Well, technically, you can get 15 if you do all these things. You can get to 15. So do we call it RM12 and then explain to everybody that they can get to 15, or do we nix that from it? And every time we come back to it, we say, look, well, for 2 years now, we've been saying we need to rewrite the zoning code. We need to overhaul the zoning code. I don't know if you all remember that conversation, but we did start talking about that a while ago. We've not been able to do it yet. And in the overhaul, we keep planning to fix that in the overhaul, either by removing the extra 3 units and just creating some other method of getting there, or by just renaming the zoning entirely. So it's not like it's hard to do it, but there hasn't been an opportune moment to do it.
And we'll refer.
You mean, so what you're saying is we would have to write it in code or change it in code?
It would make more sense if we changed code to go with it, rather than renaming it in code would be easy, but it would be a little disingenuous to just rename it RM12. It's more likely, but technically you can have 15 units. So we're not sure how to deal with it exactly yet. So we haven't pulled the trigger. And it's confusing, but it's a small problem. So we've dealt with other things instead, really.
And when we move on to some of the next agenda items, part of the direction we feel we should go with the mixed use zones speaks to this density bonus that Jared's talking about. Like across the board, you can get 12 units to an acre, but if you want to do 15, you have to do these certain steps. So we'll refer back to that when we move on to some of the next conversations.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Good question. This is another couple of the categories. Neighborhood commercial up at the top there, general commercial here at this bottom corner, and mixed use, as Melinda was mentioning. So in the mixed use category, density range between 10 and 30 dwelling units. Sorry.
Did you share your screen?
Oh, sorry. Am I not? Let me go back and I'll share the screen again. Oh, you know what? I can't share my screen because I think I'm off. Am I gone? Let me reconnect. Well, no. Do I have an option to not come back? Am I? Is that on the table?
No.
No.
Okay, I'll see if I can get back in.
What? Want me to pull it up? What slide?
I'm following on the PDF either way. So
Oh, there you go. Okay. I can get back in just a second.
So did that answer the council's questions, the specific questions you had on the R16 with being in
Yeah,
both low
I mean,
density and medium density?
It did for me. It makes more sense now because it is confusing. I'm not sure about the rest of the council members. Are you guys okay with that now? Yeah, that was.
That's why I didn't go into planning. It's too confusing for me.
It's too confusing.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm back in. Okay. See if I can share my screen again.
We'll go about 10 minutes more and take a break.
Okay. Okay. This is the wrong slide, so just one moment. Okay, here we go.
So we were there.
Neighborhood commercial. Yeah, perfect. So as you'll see here, under mixed use, one of the categories that gets called out is our TOD and mixed use, the mixed use zone itself. MCCD zoning is called out in the city center district, which is a different, in the city center category,
so I
which is
was
its own
wrong.
category.
I was wrong when I said that.
It's its own category.
Yeah.
We wanted there to be no question that you didn't get to rezone to city center even if you were, in another part of the city, that only the city center would be zoned MCCD. But interestingly, I wanted to read this top corner for you, and then we'll point out these things. All three of these future land use categories, the neighborhood commercial, the general commercial, and the mixed use, they allude to the potential appropriate inclusion of mixed use developments. And this is one of those areas where it's part of the general plan, but it's not the map necessarily, because the map has these categories and they only list these certain zones. For example, in the general commercial, it only lists the CD commercial development zone as a corresponding zone. However, its language in the category that we'll read right here alludes to mixed uses. So I'm just going to read that if it's all right down the left corner. While this designation is primarily for larger retail destinations, including regional shopping centers and standalone big boxes, it may also include mixed-use developments that are mainly commercial in nature and use. High-density multifamily residential complexes will only be considered as part of a larger master-planned mixed-use development. Smaller-scale, medium-density residential projects may be considered for neighborhood or commercial or community node areas. So again, it's referring back to those other parts of the plan that it's brought to you already if you're reading it straight through. Those commercial and neighborhood nodes and large areas, it's basically telling you, be ready for this in the future. There are going to be higher density residential components asked for in commercial developments. So what we're doing now as a city and in considering all these things is really starting to respond to some of these issues that were raised in the general plan. They're not raised directly, they're not on the map, but they are part of the plan. So I wanted to point that out. I think it's important to understand. The neighborhood commercial zone also, this neighborhood commercial designation doesn't call out anything but RNB, CN commercial neighborhood, and then that last bullet, new updated neighborhood commercial zone. We don't have that, but it recognized in the plan that we ought to have something that considered mixing of uses as well and pulling people out to the street or pulling the buildings out toward the street. That's all in that description of neighborhood commercial. So it's alluded to, but not as directly as in the general commercial.
It's an interesting.
Go ahead.
I'm a little hard to hear, but it's an interesting point to consider because when I was asked in January, I think it was the day after we had the city council meeting where we first discussed the sports mall and the RC Willie general plan amendments. I was asked the question about, well, do you think that is an appropriate zone? And my answer was intentionally worded. And I said, I think it's the best zone that we have available for those properties. And so clearly, based on feedback from the council, we understood that that wasn't something you were comfortable with. But right here, our general plan was saying you ought to consider creating a zone that is something in between that, right? Which now is essentially one of the outcomes that we'll have from the TLUR. But that, I think really this is saying we're looking at those neighborhood retail areas, those nodes, and considering that they will become areas of transition in the future. And you'll need to have a code that would be appropriate for those
Sensitive to it.
areas. Yeah.
Definitely. All right. This is, and we're probably almost to a good stopping point. I think we are actually getting to a good stopping point. I alluded to this earlier, and I just wanted to quickly show you where this is. That snippet at the bottom of this slide is from the part 1, where you're looking at the initiatives, and this is from initiative number 3, and you can see this is land use and urban design. That's element 5 that we're going through right now in part 2. But all of those things, all of those different objectives, preserve and protect viable residential neighborhoods, encourage revitalization along transit corridors, encourage form-based development at commercial nodes, support a range of commercial development scales, form-based and mixed-use development patterns, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all the different objectives, and there's not quite all of them. I think there's 3 that don't quite feed into Initiative 3. They all are shown to be connected to Initiative 3. So it's easy to say, yes, if these are things that we're pursuing, what we're doing right now, as during the TLUR that Melinda mentioned, and considering these kind of things, at least considering it and trying to write a zone that would make sense is supporting initiative number 3. So that's the kind of consideration that we do. So the goal of this item number 5, or the word I'm looking for, initiative, well, not the initiative, but the element 5, is to provide and promote a mix of land uses and development patterns that support a healthy community comprised of livable neighborhoods, vibrant economic districts, and appealing open spaces. And the objectives, as it's shown below, feed into those key initiatives. And we'll go through this. I don't know if you want to take the break before, we can go through it after, but here's the goal in the middle, and these surrounding it are the different objectives. So there's no lack of sort of reference points to look at projects with, or look at different things and compare them to the general plan. And this is, again, all outside of the map. And
Okay.
we can look at those after if you'd like.
I think it's time to take a break, but also I'm wondering, are we going to talk about TODs?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think that's- All right. Yes, this has been so helpful. Then I'll see you back about 5 to 2 o'clock. Whenever. Okay.
Thank you.
We have a question, and also I just wanted to let you know that we need to end this by 4. So if there's things that we need to that we haven't dealt with, we'll continue it at a future time. So anyway, Dale, you had a question.
Yeah, and it goes back, and I should have asked this an hour ago when we were talking about it, but it goes back to mixed use and traffic studies. And because people don't understand the traffic studies, and I don't claim to either. But you said a mixed use of, and I'll make up the numbers, of 75 gives no more traffic than 30 in a single family home. And I want to know if my assumption is right. That's because in a mixed use, a lot of the services that if you're in a housing development, you jump in your car and go to 7-Eleven, or you jump in your car and go someplace, a lot of those services are in the mixed use, so you just go walk to them or bike to them. Is that the case?
Yes. The short answer is yes. The mixed use, the hope, and I know the hope is always that those trips are reduced, and studies do show that they do get reduced. It's trip reduction is what we're always hoping for in mixed use developments. That because of the nature of the development and the proximity to commercial, the services that they need and things like that, that we will see reduction in trips and dependence on automobiles. The closer you get, and then if you combine that and put that same project, that same mixed use project near a transit hub, near a transit station, a BRT, whether it's a BRT line or whether it's the transit, the tracks line or the front runner line, you get an even better result from that trip reduction, because people aren't even commuting out of it. They're walking across to the train station and taking the train up to where their job is or whatever. So you get even fewer. It's trying to reduce the dependence on automobiles. at the same time, it's trying to make a livable place where it's nice to walk to certain areas. There are a couple of good examples that spring to mind that have become sort of national touchstones. The Pearl District in Portland is one of them, and there's the pollution. The air quality has been improved in the last 20 years while the Pearl has become a place. Even the obesity levels in the population are less than the surrounding areas because people are walking around. They've made it, if you create a walkable environment for people, they'll use it. That's the thinking, and it does show up in the statistics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
How do you define what's placed in that mixed use zone? So you make sure that you've got, you don't have to go out of that development to get the things that you want.
Right.
How do you define that?
Well, that's the tough part, especially here where we don't have as much density as we'd need to maybe support a grocery stores are kind of the end all be all of what we'd like to see in a mixed use development. We'd love people to be able to go buy their groceries on foot and not have to get in a car to do that. Notwithstanding the 3 months worth of sliced cheese you need from Costco, obviously. That you might have to use your car for. But everything else, a jug of milk, a loaf of bread, it's hard to get those uses. We are starting to see them finally in the valley. We haven't seen too many of them, but Lee's Market and a couple of other places, some Harmon's is reaching into this a little bit, are starting to create smaller, more locally oriented grocery facilities. It'll take more time to develop, but that's the hope. Then the other part of that question, Diane, is how well are the residential uses that are in a mixed use project really connected to the commercial uses? And that's something we have to overcome as well. A lot of commercial uses just kind of turn their back to the residential, and then you really have a residential apartment complex with some commercial out front. They're not tied together. When there's a project that we're going to talk about further on in the workshop, where we tried to, in our mixed use zoning, tie the two uses together with that memorandum of understanding and some central features that are related to both, so that you increase the odds of somebody from that apartment complex wanting to walk across to the restaurants. Where we've stopped short is saying, thou shalt only allow restaurants, or you can only have this. We have a good mixed use project that is an office building with townhomes. It's still technically mixed use, but there's not a lot of reason to suspect that many people from those townhomes are actually walking over to that office building for anything. It might be better if that office building were services, but there wasn't enough density to support something like that. Your subway's not going to survive there. So you hope that you have to kind of balance it as you go. We haven't dictated what kinds of uses outside of just the use tables. We try to promote non-auto oriented things. So
That's
that
what I was
make it more
wondering.
available.
Right.
And then you just strengthen the pedestrian connections the best you can. We need to do that better through code. That's one of the things we're looking at.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. I think we ended right here. This is, as I said, the objectives are circled around the goal here in the center. And in the next slides, we just have a few examples of those objectives and strategies. We didn't try to list them all or go through them all, but these are indicative of the kinds of things that you find in the listed objectives and the strategies that support them in this part of the general plan. And all of these, bear in mind as we look at them, should support this overall goal, providing and promoting a mix of land uses and development patterns to support healthy communities. So objective 2, and these are just snipped right out of the plan, to preserve and protect the quality of life for a range of viable residential neighborhoods. Strategies that support that then prioritize infill and redevelopment for commercial development over expansion into residential neighborhoods. So we haven't had a lot of trouble in Murray because we have a really strong already commercial and retail sector. We haven't had the problems of commercial zoning, recently anyway, commercial zoning creeping further into residential areas and saying, well, we want to rezone all this land to commercial. These houses that used to be houses, we need to expand I suspect that you did have this problem or this situation years ago when the car lots were coming to State Street and moving into neighborhoods. It looks familiar to me from my days in South Salt Lake, and that was an issue there. I think we're probably through that. As commercial need for land, other than some big uses that are already established, shrinks, we're not going to see that problem as much. But still, prioritizing infill and redevelopment for commercial development. is better than saying we're going to rezone these big swaths of land that are already established as something else to commercial. Developing form-based development and design guidelines that guide the quality of projects. We were just kind of talking about that a moment ago. Looking at the nature of the project and what's needed and how you can kind of control that better or urge it in the right direction. And then another one, enhance residential streets with trees, landscaping and park strips and front setbacks, and pedestrian scale lighting. It makes a big difference in the quality of life in a neighborhood. How much people want to get out and walk depends a lot. And the more people walk in their neighborhoods, the more they are tied to them and the more viable that neighborhood stays as people take pride and ownership of not just their home and their property, but their whole area that they live in. Second objective listed there, encourage revitalization along key transportation corridors and in the core of the city. And this has really been an overarching strategy that stuck with us, at least as staff, from when we did the general plan update, that the core of the city was strong, but that we ought to focus our efforts there so that the impacts from development and redevelopment were felt more in the core of the city where it could absorb those shocks better. Develop context-specific corridor plans to guide coordinated land use and transportation improvements. We don't have those yet, but that's one of the strategies we should look at trying to implement in the future. And again, offer zoning, density, street improvements, and other indirect incentives for areas that are targeted for revitalization. Again, you want to draw that development interest to those areas as opposed to letting them expand or put their interests into brownfield development or greenfield development, rather. Sorry, I said that wrong. So you want to incentivize developers because they've all got money to spend, and you have to make it worthy of their spending that money in a part of the town you're trying to revitalize, instead of just going to the fringes of our development edges in other cities further north and south or west and spending their money there. At the core of the city, we have a lot to offer, but we need to make sure we emphasize those things and entice those developers to come to our areas instead of pushing out and causing problems in other places where we don't want them. Another objective 10 and 11, we moved past the others and went to these because they're kind of interesting to look at as well. Objective 10, promote a transition of development patterns between commercial areas and stable residential neighborhoods. And this has come up recently. It's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of focus on this one as we talked about it. The strategy support transitions with form-based development and design guidelines. We want to look at buffering. That's come up a lot lately. How do we buffer these kind of developments that are being proposed from stable neighborhoods? How do we transition to those neighborhoods? And we don't have all the answers for that yet, but that's something that we need to try to find. The second strategy listed there, review zoning to ensure that parcels have the appropriate designation to allow for a transition of uses. Again, there are zones that serve better as transitions, but some of those zones have created their own concerns with densities and with a lack of sort of specificity for buffering, and we're trying to address all of those things as we move forward as well. The third strategy, adopt more detailed and specific landscape and tree requirements for buffers between commercial and residential areas. Trees must be used as a buffering mechanism. Walls alone are not an accepted buffering mechanism. And right now, we do that through design review with the Planning Commission, but that ought to be more codified, perhaps in our mixed-use zones especially, where we have the potential for impacts coming up against residential neighborhoods. Trees do a lot, and they ought to be more a focus of what we're doing. Objective 12, stimulate reinvestment in deteriorating areas of the city to support growth and enhance the image of the community. And the strategy to support that offers zoning, density, and street improvements and other indirect incentives for areas that are targeted for revitalization. Again, just like we talked about in the other slide, there are areas where we want that reinvestment to come, and we're going to need to offer zoning and density to have that happen. Without those incentives, those areas can continue to languish. We don't want to see that happen. We have to strike the right balance, in other words. So those are just examples of the kinds of objectives and the strategies that we would look at as a proposal is brought to us or as a project comes to us, and even with the zone changes that are brought to us as well. Melinda mentioned, and this is another section that we want to get into, and I'm assuming as we go forward from here, there's probably going to be more and more questions. And so the slides are going to get less colorful and less interesting and more full of words. So feel free to ask questions to keep everybody going. Melinda mentioned that we looked at other cities and the idea of these being working documents or living documents and not static plans. It's fair to say that general plans are not meant to be static documents for all the reasons we've already talked about today. But again, we talked about how in a growing community, every 5 years or so, you ought to be doing an update. And every 10 years, you really ought to have an update and review that plan. And oftentimes, cities get to that 10 years and say, look, we're really still okay if you're a city that nothing's happening in. That's not likely to ever be the case for Murray. We're probably going to get to 10 years and need to make at least some significant updates to the plan. And some of those we've already identified in the conversation today. But even with all that considered, the 5-year reviews and the 10 years, plans to stay relevant, as we've seen, it's reasonable to expect that there will be some adjustment. So we compared some future land use map amendments and zone map amendments to other Wasatch Front cities. And Zach in our office put this together, and there's some really interesting data that goes with this. And if you'd like it, we can send it to you, but it would be pages and pages, because he's got it penciled out as it was this general plan designation and it moved to this, and it was this zone and it moved to this. And there's a lot of really fun information there. But this table just shows you kind of when the plans were adopted and what kind of amendments they processed in 2020. And then we're at the bottom there, so you can kind of see the comparators. Lehigh is an interesting one. Adopted the plan in 2018, 8 general plan amendments, 19 rezones. Lehigh has I think it's fair to say, a lot of things going on. There's a lot of change and a lot of influx of growth and things that they're trying to deal with. Even with a plan from 2018, Draper, same kind of deal, 2019, but 9 general plan amendments and 13 rezones. These are all adjustments that may have been anticipated or may not have been, depending.
Yeah, so I wanted this information to be put together to just provide some measure of comfort to the council that the general plan amendments that we have had requested and that have brought before you, it's not an anomaly. It's a very common thing. And in fact, we are on the lower end compared to a lot of other cities. And so, hopefully this gives you at least an idea that it does happen. It's not uncommon. And the numbers listed below for Murray is that we had 5 that came forward, and they began last year in 2020, but only 2 were completed. So the 3 that weren't were the ones that have now been withdrawn. The sports mall withdrew yesterday too. I don't know if you, yeah. So we were notified, I think yesterday they withdrew. So those are the 3, the sports mall, RC Willie and Howland, that did not move forward. So that's the difference between the math there in the parentheses. But this should give you a good idea of how common it is. And when I mentioned earlier also that some cities are going away from even having a future land use map, the 3 cities that under the general plan amendment have the NA, those are those cities that have chosen to go in a different direction and not have a future land use map. So
I have a question in regards to that. Are they cities that have the same form of government as ours?
I don't know the answer to that.
What was the list? Sandy City, was that one of them? It wasn't Sandy. Oh yeah, Sandy does have the same form of government as we do. Bountiful does not. Bountiful and Midvale does not. So it's I think it would be just a philosophical type of thing versus something that would function better or worse or differently based on the form of government.
So I don't know the specifics of Sandy and Bountiful there, but with Midvale, I was going to say Millvale. With Midvale, Zach in our office is a planning commissioner in Midvale, and their general plan, for example, instead of having a future land use map that identifies every property the way we've done, they've just got a big map that identifies areas of transition and areas of stability, and that's their first kind of line of review. Well, you're asking for this change. Is it in an area that we've already identified as an area of transition? Then okay, there's no more specificity than that. It kind of lets them move a little more freely. And I don't know what Sandy's and Bountiful's are. I only know that one because Zach's talked about that. So we could get more.
I have a question, and just to understand, is this something that your office is wanting to recommend that we do without?
No.
Or in the future, or are we just looking to see who has it, who doesn't?
No, we just kind of find it interesting, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. And Jared mentioned that during the process that started in 2014, it was something that the consultant discussed. And at that time, the city felt that they should just leave it with the future land use map. I think that it's just interesting to note, and interesting to know that there's so many different ways to arrive at an end conclusion, right? Because as I said, the state code requires that every city have a general plan, but it doesn't have to have the same format. And what would work well here in Murray clearly doesn't work well in every other city. So it's just kind of more a point of interest than anything. Although when we do go through the process, whenever that is, to do the 5-year general plan update, it's maybe something that we would talk about, but probably not something you would implement until you were doing like a full comprehensive general plan, which in theory would be 2027, because the 2017 plan, that would be 10 years.
And even then, you could still very likely and very reasonably come back around to say, well, we still find this useful to have the future land use map designations. It's a good touchstone for people to be able to understand at least the basics of a general plan. I don't like that people get confused and think that it is the whole plan, but on the other hand, it is very accessible for people, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. It at least gets them involved in talking about the process.
And you could also look at it and say, so as I'm looking at these 3 cities, Bountiful is actually a city that I would say is very similar to us in that their land is very much developed. There's no annexations. There's no real growth. Murray is in a similar position. And so if you were going to get to a point where you really feel like, yeah, this is not going to be something that we would envision changing, and the future land uses would be very stable, maybe that would be a factor as to why you would transition over to eliminating that. Or also, if you were one of those communities that was growing at such a rapid rate that you couldn't keep up, you may want to eliminate that as another process or another round of application that you would have to go through in order for the growth to occur. So those could be a couple of factors that you would want to consider looking at that. But it's just interesting to know that there's so many ways to get to the end designation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I will go on to, and again, if you'd like to see the more detailed information, we'll get that sent to you from Zach if you'd like. It's kind of fun to see. Another thing that we promised you we'd come back to, Chapter 11, the plan administration. The final chapter is not an element of the plan; it's administration of the plan. It's structured the same way, however, and administration. We have these objectives, and this objective 7, I think, is interesting in the statement. Make the general plan dynamic, with the ability to amend as future conditions change, and that's exactly what we've been talking about. The question was asked earlier: is there language in the plan that says that it ought to stay fluid? This is as direct as it gets. Make it dynamic, anticipating future conditions need amendments. The strategy then listed is every 5 years evaluate those past 5 years of implementation, take a new look at that data and trends, and address new issues that may have emerged. Engage city departments in the evaluation and provide the general public a chance to provide input on new ideas or issues. So we really ought to do that 5-year evaluation. And we intend to do that. But now, objective 4 is where I get to be embarrassed. So, objective 4: regularly report implementation status. So we're here today for you guys to talk about the general plan because we haven't done that enough with you, basically, if I can summarize it that way. And the strategy is prepare an annual progress report that includes key accomplishments, priority issues, action items, and key implementing agencies. Analyze and report on how actions align with the policy directions of the plan. We should be doing that every year for you. We have not done that. So Melinda can fire me this evening and we'll just have everybody else take over. But we should be doing that for you so that this is more familiar to you. And if we were doing that, more of these things would make more sense to you. So
And going forward,
we'll
I'm
recommit
sure you
forward,
will.
going forward to do that anyway. You guys pick the month in which it should happen, and we will do it.
Okay.
Hey, Jared,
Yeah.
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I can't see if anyone else is talking. Sorry. My question is, for that 5-year reassessment, is there a formal process for that that needs to be followed, or is it more of an informal assessment and reflection on how it's going?
The only information I have to speak to that with is what I just read. So I think it's open for whatever you'd like it to be, or whatever we feel like as a group is appropriate. I think what we'd probably like to do, if I'm shooting from the hip, is we'd like to probably produce a report that might be a dozen pages long that says, here are the things that have happened, and here's how we feel like this is going, and here are key things coming up that we should try to implement. And then we can have a conversation. That lets us have a conversation about whether those are the right things to try to implement, because we've mentioned already talking today how many different kind of avenues there are within this plan that could be implemented. This area plan, that area plan, this corridor study, that corridor study. I think in our updates to you yearly, we ought to be talking about which ones of those things we've seen as most important coming up, and then we can have that conversation. And the result of the update can be you guys telling us that yes, or that no, we want to refocus on something else instead. But along with that, a kind of a comprehensive report of what has gone on and how things are being implemented. I would see it as a report, and then we would present it to you. We'd issue it to you on paper or by email or whatever, but then we'd want to present it to you in a meeting like this.
Okay, thank you. It was something that jumped out at me when I was rereading the general plan, and just it felt that, which I believe would be next year, that 5-year mark, that just organically wanting to reassess as growth and change happens in the community. Just that we're just there a little early.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and so you'd seen that. So I'm glad that I admitted that we hadn't done it. So, okay. Thank you. Good question.
And Jared, the mayor said you don't get off that easy, which means you don't get fired. You have to stay and do the work.
Yeah, I'll stay in.
Right? Is that what you meant, Mayor?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, they're going to be making fun of me when I get back to the office anyway, so it's okay. I'm ready for it. That's not the right. Yes, it is. That is the right one. So those are only 2 of the objectives that relate to that administration. There are all these other objectives as well. Just like the other elements, it has a lot of objectives. There's a lot of detail there. Regularly report on it, coordinate implementation responsibilities, link the objectives with the annual city budget. As we get more into it and try to make this more a part of our planning process, we'll try to do those things and do that through that reporting. Let me move to the next slide here, and we can talk about other issues that deal with the application of the general plan. And we've talked about a lot of these things today. So as you have questions, please feel free to ask them, because I'm going to be kind of rehashing some things we've already touched on. Wanted to use the example of Murray Square. When it came through the planning process, we were calling it Ben Winkle Crossing. If you know it by that name instead, it's called Murray Square now, and it is getting ready to get under construction. And that's the Kmart property on 900 East. So we did amend the general plan and rezone that property to mixed use in, I can't remember, in August of 2019. And the resulting project is 421 apartments and 21,000 square feet of retail. And as we tried to review that application, not the project itself, we did it again for the project, but for the rezoning and the general plan amendment, I went back to the staff report from that rezoning. So this isn't from these snips aren't from the project's review, they're from the staff report from the zoning change. And we talked about how the subject property was designated as general commercial, and then we pointed out that statement in that general commercial designation that high density housing could be a part of commercial projects as long as they were master planned, et cetera. And we come to a conclusion. In the next slide, I'll show you. We come to the conclusion, these are statements from the staff's conclusion. While there are some opportunities to repurpose these sites, newer development patterns have often included the introduction of higher density housing along with commercial. In the 2017 general plan, the mixed use designation was applied to properties near the tracks and front runner stations and in the central core of the city. The creation of community centers where services could be provided in more walkable, pedestrian-friendly environments on smaller scales and closer to the largely residential areas of the city was contemplated by the general plan. And then this bottom quote is for that. The subject property has the potential, or sorry, the previous quote from that designation statement relates to that. The subject property has the potential to better serve the purposes of the general plan and become a more integrated part of the larger community if redevelopment occurs under the regulations of the proposed mixed-use zone. Staff recommends that there is a need for the proposed change of zoning. When we looked at this project and looked at the statements in the general plan about transition areas, development along corridors, trying to create those links between centers, we felt like this project as mixed use served all of those purposes of the general plan better than the empty building, obviously. But even if the empty building were repurposed as Spirit of Halloween or something, and even if we did get to develop pad sites out front, not a lot of connection between the two uses. Or if they had simply tried to carve off the back half and add a series of single-family homes, a few cul-de-sacs, and then put commercial out front. While that would be residential and commercial, it wouldn't be a connected mixed-use development. So you don't get the benefits of trip reduction, and you don't get that connection between those two things. And this area, because of the 9th East Corridor, was able to handle the traffic patterns and things that come with a mixed-use development better than another part of the city. So this made sense with respect to those different objectives of the plan that we've been talking about throughout the day, and the initiatives of creating centers, et cetera, and vibrant neighborhoods. Because in this kind of a scenario, we get to dictate as a city that they're connected, that there's plaza areas for people to gather in, and we were able also through this process to keep that connection open for that, the Mill Creek neighborhood that I call Mer Creek, the little.
Is that the property that we also had the memorandum for the council?
Yes, this is the memorandum of understanding. This is it. This was the initial. This is the prettiest of the plans. But yeah, so there were some reasons that we stated in here, and there's more than that in the staff report also, but I just wanted to give you a kind of a taste of the thinking as it applied to this particular request to change the zone. Again, the project came later, but some of those same things came about. Agenda item number 2, we already talked about, the R16. Is everybody still comfortable with that? Okay. Item 3 on the agenda, if we're ready to move to that, was to talk about the mixed use zone and the overview of that. So Melinda mentioned, sorry.
Well, at this point, we've kind of, Jared and I have shared with you what we kind of wanted to share with you about the general plan and how we apply it, how it's utilized in our office. Do you have additional questions about that? Anything that we didn't cover? Anything else that you want to bring up before we maybe conclude that part?
I have a question. If we have questions going forward, who could we contact? How can we get those answered? What's the best way to do that? And
you can always call me or Jared, but I think all of the planning staff are capable of answering the questions. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're always happy to talk about it. Any questions you have, give us a
great.
call.
I don't want to bug you, but you don't mind if
No, it's just absolutely fine.
We take a lot of calls in planning, and a lot of that comes from the public notices that we send out, where people receive a notice and have a question about something that we've scheduled a public hearing for on the Planning Commission agenda. A lot of calls are people, sometimes it's people just even wondering, like, what's going on? I'm seeing this construction site over there. We get a lot of calls about people that want to know what they can do with their property, or they want to build a pool or a shed. What do they have to do that? And so we're happy to take those calls from the council as well.
Questions.
It's definitely, it's very much a part of our day-to-day duties. So
right.
It would not be a bother to us.
Not at all.
Awesome.
And if the next sections, if the next items that we talk about raise questions or remind you of other questions from these other things, it's not like it's closed off for good. So
just to summarize, the general plan, to use verbiage from Brett, is is a living document, and things change as conditions change, like we had with 2020 and the pandemic. Business changes, the business plan, business model changes, then we have the ability inside the general plan. It's not written in granite, stone.
Right.
We change to either facilitate housing or business or both to make it a more viable area instead of just letting it die and sit dormant.
Yes, I think that's a fair summary.
Yeah, and a lot of what we do here in the city, my department, every department really is something that is dynamic and shifts. We did budget amendments. I mean, we do them all the time, but we did several ones last year because of COVID-19 and not knowing what that held in store. A lot of the changes that we bring forward to the Planning Commission and to the City Council are text amendments too. So, really, I think most everything we do has a certain amount of flexibility with it. There's also times too where people come to us and say, I want to be able to do this in this zone. And we look at that. And again, we go through the process of looking at the general plan and there's not really a reason to do that or support for that. So there's times to kind of say yes to change. And there's times also where we come forward and say, this really isn't something that would be supported or something that, we feel like would work well in Murray City or something that the city council would feel comfortable with. One of the greatest assets that we got from the dialogue that came from the general plan amendments and the zone map amendments on the 3 mixed use sites, or the commercial sites going to mixed use with Sports Mall, RC Willey, and Howland was information from you as the body that sets that legislation and how you felt about that and what you were comfortable with. Because we don't want to be telling developers that, yeah, this is something they'll think it's great if that's not how you feel. And so a lot of this too really is dependent on having a good working relationship and a knowledge of where you're at as the council, because in the end, it's really not us and what our opinion that matters. It's your opinion. You're the ones who have the vote. You're the ones that, answer to your constituents. And we really want to support what it is that you feel comfortable with. So, and then that really was the essence for moving towards doing the temporary land use regulation and taking a hard look at that so that we can all get on the same page.
Great.
Okay,
Sounds good. We really appreciate it.
that is a good segue into this slide, because as Melinda just mentioned, we really took a lot away from those meetings, and we had a lot of meetings with developers as well over the last little while. That's in the memo, and a lot of this is going to be repeats of information that's in the memo that Melinda had put out that you all should have a copy of now. But the concerns that we heard and the things that were issues that we need to look at were density. Obviously, that core, and I think we've talked about this before, but when the city first implemented mixed-use zones, they only implemented them around the transit stations. And they did them, some of them with no density limits at all. And the others with 80 to 100 units per acre. And then when we made that modification in 2019 to allow less density, as we started taking our first steps toward looking at the mixed use or the possibility of mixed use outside of the core of the city, we graded that density down. But some of those concerns it still does generate some concerns, even at 50 or 60 or 40 units the acre, even further out that it is. So we want to take a good hard look at density and see what really makes sense. Traffic, we talked about earlier, Councilmember Dominguez mentioned traffic. When mixed use projects with higher densities are not right near the best transit stations, you don't get that same benefit that you hope for, or you get a reduced benefit of traffic reduction or trip reduction. So that has to be considered carefully as we look at mixed uses and they range further from the cores of the city. And the same with connections between residential and commercial. Those become more important. In the really dense projects that would be next to a station, those connections are almost impossible to get away from. You're building on top of one on top of the other. In the further flung areas, they're going to be horizontal mixed uses, and you have to make sure that they're tied together as best you can if you want to get the maximum benefit of doing mixed use in the first place, which is to get that vibrant neighborhood and that reduction of dependence on automobiles. Parking, almost just like traffic. Yeah,
sorry, Jared, when you say horizontal, it just means across, like the growth would happen horizontally and not up, right?
Well, yes. Let me go to, we think about mixed uses and define them in two different kinds: horizontal mixed use and vertical mixed use. And I'm going to go back to, let me go back to my slides. I'm going to zip back to a different slide for just a second. And so in this particular project, these buildings are all residential, and these are the commercial buildings. And they represent a certain percentage of the site that's based on the frontage along 9th East. This is a classic horizontal mixed-use development. So there's a mix of uses, and they're all tied together, but they're not on top of each other. If these buildings were out on the street and the residential was up top and the commercial was on the bottom, that's a vertical mixed-use development. Sorry, so that's the difference between the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in something like that, it would be commercial would kind of be on the outskirts or away from the residential.
Right.
Versus all in one building.
Yes, exactly. So mixed in the same building, vertical. Separated from each other, horizontal. And this is a more likely development pattern and a more prevalent development pattern, horizontal mixed use, outside of the core of the city. You see this in lots of shopping districts where there's a lot of residential and it's loosely connected to the commercial. The best planning is to connect those as strongly as you can so you get the best benefits out of it, even when they're separated like this. That's why we try to do these plazas that tie them together, create clear pedestrian paths from the residential to the commercial, make it easy to walk through this development and not feel like you're walking through just a parking lot to go to the 7-Eleven here or the 7-Eleven. That's basically where my mind is. I need the Diet Mountain Dew.
Jared, so
restaurant here, to the highbrow restaurant that you would imagine. Yeah.
So just to echo what Rosalba said, horizontally then is opposite of density then.
Well, it might be the same density, but the commercial that's required is not necessarily underneath that density in the same building.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and these are going to be less dense though generally, because where they are, this project, for example, Murray Square is 36 units to the acre. I can't remember what it ended up at. I want to say 36 units to the acre. In a project where you have the building over the top of the commercial, you're probably going to be more in the range. Well, we have that over on Murray Crossing. That's Murray Crossing next to the station as you come down Vine Street is 68 units to the acre because it's up above it. And so those typically are more dense, yes.
And then that's the vertical mixed use.
Vertical mixed use.
The Granton Square, the Hamlet Homes.
Horizontal mixed use.
Horizontal mixed use, where the commercial is out front, the office building, and the residential is tucked back behind that.
And those are typically less dense, yeah. Okay, is that if that helps, I'm going to move to the other slides. Rosalba, did that get your question answered?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So density traffic parking is very similar to traffic. We hope for in mixed use developments, and I know this is a big concern. This came up consistently with everyone. Minimum parking requirements for mixed use zones that we have implemented so far that we've written had not anticipated that redevelopment being further from transit hubs. Where you're close to that transit station, the hope is that you have not only that commercial that's available to you from your project and other projects, that you get to not have to get in your car to go get your milk or bread or whatever, but also you don't have to get in your car to commute because you're close enough to the station that we hope that people that want to commute on the stations move into those units so that they're not using their cars, because we all benefit from them not using their cars. Even if you're commuting, we benefit from all of those hundreds of people not using their cars. We benefit in air quality, we benefit in traffic congestion, we benefit in not having to have as much parking taking up space in the world. But again, that was the assumption that we were going to do mixed use right at the transit stations. And now development patterns have changed and mixed use is becoming more prevalent in other parts of the city. And our parking standards do not reflect that. So we're looking at how to make that parking ratio more viable for projects that are further out. where you are going to be still more dependent on your car than you would be at Murray Crossing right by the station. Buffering, we talked about that a little bit earlier. We do have buffering requirements, and we deal with them more through site planning than anything. And the consensus that we've heard from everybody meeting with you all was that we'd like to see those hardened up in code a little bit, so that there's more feelings of security on the part of people who have to live next to these projects, that they know kind of what the buffer is going to be. They don't have to just get told, well, there'll be a buffer, it'll be great. They'll know what components it'll have and how big it will be, and that it's been taken very seriously prior to it ever becoming a project that's going through design review. So we'll look at ways to make that more context sensitive. Green space and open space, the amenities in common space, and this goes without saying, when you put people in dense environments, the common open space that they have access to is more important than anything, because they don't have a lot of private access to open space. They have a balcony, and the rest of their access to open space is at whatever facility they have, and we hope that they're near parks, but they may not be. So the amenities and the open space in the projects themselves need to be seriously considered and be significant.
Jared?
Yeah.
What is currently required for the MU zone?
15% needs to be open space. What we'd like to probably look at rewriting to be more significant may not increase the percentage, but we may want to increase the accessibility of that open space. We might want to increase the percentage. We haven't really looked at it fully enough yet to know that. But the access that everyone has to that open space and that amenity needs to be looked at carefully and made sure that it's increased a little bit.
I agree.
We have some amenities that are not the greatest, and we have some people do a really good, some developers really come in and do a really good job of creating great spaces that their people are going to want to use. Amenity decks that are barbecue pits and pools, et cetera, and the people have access to that. But then by the same token, they'll put an amenity on the site somewhere, and you're in a large apartment building and you have no way to get out of your apartment and kind of directly to that open space. You have to go down a corridor, down an elevator, and then across a parking lot, and then you're at your little dog park. Not good enough. If that's your only place to do that, it needs to be more carefully considered. And we just don't have the code written to force that yet. So we try to do it through site design. That, just like the buffer, we'd like to harden that up a little bit in the code.
Right.
Not to the point where it's a fine line, because you don't want to be so restrictive that people just don't want to deal with you. So you have to suggest these things and make sure that they're reasonable in their requirement. So with that said, we want to make sure that the amenities that we get and the open spaces that these projects, these dense mixed-use projects create, are very, very accessible and usable. And I'm annoying, but I'm going to go back to a slide real quick, if I can. And I'm going to refer back to this Murray Square project. Some of this stuff, this was an earlier design, and some of these areas right here were increased, and it's got a kind of a curve to it now, and that plaza in the middle is larger than it was. And this was a difficult thing to get done, but we wanted them to create openings from these units, at least the ones that were on the outside of the apartment building, directly onto the parking lot. They were really resistant to that, but in the end, they agreed and did do that, so that people could not have to go all the way to the end of the unit and walk all the way down here and come out. That at least these folks could get straight out onto this and be more likely to want to come out here and enjoy this kind of space. Yeah, we really felt strongly about it. And in here too, in the original plan, in this kind of central corridor, none of the apartments had access onto that little quad there. They've got a little quad like there, nice little open space, and they have to walk down here and come out and walk back into it. No one's going to do that. And this is the only open space they have. So their access to it is kind of what we're talking about. We've been able to do that through site design and because we're pushy as staff people. It would be better to have a little bit of code to help support it more.
Yeah.
So we want to look at that too. And that's the last time we'll come back to that slide, I promise.
Now, don't say.
You never know, right? So that's green space and open space. Mixed housing types. This came up and it's a really interesting concept. The best communities and the most stable neighborhoods are those neighborhoods that have a mix of housing types. And I think we heard this consistently from you all, and we've heard it from other people as well. Variety, and this is, I can't remember where I took this statement from. Variety invites reinvestment and allows people to remain in their community as their needs change. So as your home becomes less accessible or less usable to you as you age, you want to stay, even if you can't stay in that home, it would be great if you had an opportunity to stay near that neighborhood or in that neighborhood. And you can't really do that if if your neighborhood is not a mixed housing type neighborhood. So where we have the opportunity to encourage those or maintain those where they do already exist and keep investment going into those homes, we want to try to do that. I'm not sure exactly how we do that yet. That's not something we're prepared to answer yet. We're working on all that now, but it's definitely a goal. The same goes for mixed incomes. Affordable housing, and we have a whole moderate income housing element in the plan. It's one of the, we went through element 5, but element 9 is the affordable housing plan, right? Affordable housing should exist alongside market rate housing for the most livable communities overall. And the Pearl that I mentioned earlier is a good example of that as well. If you want to look up the Pearl on the internet, there's the socioeconomic data for the Pearl in Portland is really interesting. It looks like a very, my old boss's term is coming to my head and I can't get rid of it. It looks like a very Tony neighborhood, but some of the incomes are 60% of the median. And there's a lot of mixed income in the Pearl, and it makes it a great place that people really like living. So if you don't qualify for the subsidies to get into that neighborhood, you pay premiums to live in the neighborhood alongside people who are being subsidized to live in the neighborhood. It's a good example of something that has really worked out exactly like they thought it would. And we would hope for something like that with mixed incomes. Adequate facilities under services, and this is an interesting one. We heard a lot that adequate facilities and services are important, and it's important for the council to understand up front when you're making a decision on a zone change that those services are going to be okay, that they're not going to be impacted, and that they're existent and ready to help. And we need to find a way to bake that into the approval process, because the changes of zoning for these kinds of densities, for mixed use especially, are troublesome if we don't know that those things are handled up front.
Jared?
Yeah.
Going back to mixed incomes, a couple of years ago, a couple of us went to a conference, National League of Cities, and we had to create a city.
Oh, right.
And we had to balance everything. I mean, it was a fascinating study. And that was one of the things that they really encouraged, and I may have mentioned that to you before.
You did.
Is the mixed incomes and how studies have shown that it really works well, and it's a positive thing.
It generally does make has a positive impact on neighborhoods. When you spread that, in some ways it's spreading that need out for affordable housing, and that's a better outcome than creating one place where you have the 3,000 affordable units that you need in your city. Let's put them all here. Right. That's going to end badly.
Right. And Brett loved that. Didn't you remember how much you loved doing? It was, oh my.
Oh, yeah. But that was brutal.
Sorry. Did I laugh out loud? Sorry.
No, that's really
the mayor was part of that too, as I remember. You remember when we did that? That was anyway. We learned a lot, and that was one of the things. It was really good, but it was hard. So we kind of understand what you.
Yeah, no, that's great, and we heard that across the board from the council members. So
and
we really appreciate it.
And being able to know that information is helpful, because then that gives us, ideas for drafting code, which we haven't done yet, that can help accomplish some of those goals. But one thing I wanted to mention is we talked about mixed income neighborhoods. We've also talked about a mix of housing opportunities, and those are very different, but they're also very related. So where a townhome is a different type of residential unit than an apartment or a patio home, all three of those have different variations too of what income level may be able to afford to live in that type of a unit. So encouraging a mix of those types of variety with the housing units offered automatically helps to attract a mixed income neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Great.
It's a win-win, so good.
Yeah.
I have a question. Was that something maybe that wasn't considered when it comes to fire clay? And why it's kind of like been the problem child, per se, or?
There are a few reasons that.
Maybe a component of it.
It is a component of it, yeah. I would say yes. It wasn't, fire clay had its own, unique set of problems, I think. And when I say fire clay, I'm assuming we're talking about the two large apartment complexes west of the tracks, right?
Right.
Because that's generally what people, when people say fire clay, that's generally what they mean. Brick Gate and Lions Gate. The east portion of fire clay has been developed in a different way. Those first two sets of apartments were developed without any. They were developed with the densities of mixed use, but without any of the amenities of mixed use. They have nice street appeal, kind of street improvements, and some landscaping improvements that are nice. And depending on your taste, the brickwork is nice. But they don't have any commercial. They didn't have any. They didn't get the commercial uses they were supposed to get those trip reductions and parking reductions. They were also done with more bedroom counts than you would expect in a typical TOD development, a transit-oriented development, as opposed to just a mixed-use development. So they were done in a way that kind of created some of those problems. Yes.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, and it's easy for us in 2021 to look back and say, what has not worked well over there over the last 10, 12, 13 years. But I think some of the densities, I think some of the parking requirements were very aggressive and really essentially, I think, ahead of the time that we're at. Now, to some extent, that's kind of how you want to be, because you can't go back and add in after it's already constructed. But I think some of the challenges that have come from over there were that they were too far ahead of where society would have caught up to by this time. Yeah. And some of the zoning code, I think, really for this area just didn't make any sense. Like when they counted in the on-street parking towards the unit required parking. And that has not worked well over on the west side of the fire clay area. The code was changed, and there's other areas in fire clay that don't have that significant of parking issues since those code changes have been put in place. But I think really it would be safe to say that it was a very aggressive code, and it just has been slow in having all of the benefits realized of what that code is supposed to be.
Yeah.
That may have been a more appropriate code for a true downtown area like Salt Lake or like Denver, rather than Murray, which is, 10 miles from the true downtown of the Wasatch Front.
Right. Yeah, does that make sense, Rosala?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Yeah. And let me see if I can. Okay, so services, and we wanted to, again, we haven't written this stuff yet, but we have a concept for it that was described in the memo, and we'll go over that shortly. But that conversation is a good segue to the next item, which is commercial space. We don't address in the current mixed use zones that we have. We didn't really consider, because they were talking about putting mixed use zones in around transit stations on underutilized properties that were mostly industrial. And
so was it like a blank slate?
It was more of a blank slate than an area like the RC Willey or than the Howland project that came forward. We hadn't really considered how to adaptively reuse properties with the zoning code. We have ideas about it, and developers have ideas about it, but we didn't have any code really that addressed that. So that needs to be considered as well. We never talked about live work units. Well, we talk about live work units, but we don't define them well, and we don't state whether they would count or to what percentage they would count. We need to hammer that out too. Sorry, you looked like you were going to say something.
Well, so a couple things. One, the adaptability of existing spaces. Right now, our code in the mixed use has setbacks that don't have any type of a range on them. And what that would mean is, let's just use the point at 53rd as an example. In order for that site to conform to all of the setbacks that we have in the code right now,
Gary Howland would basically have to tear everything down and start over again. And that's not something that we want. The buildings exist, they're there. And so we have to have some way to have flexibility in the code to provide for, let's say, a range of setbacks, so that if the building is set back 20 feet from the street, but we want 10 feet or less, that we have some way to adapt that and have them be compliant with code. And that'll be, I think, really tricky for us to address in the code rewrite. But something that is important, because we don't want to just contribute a bunch of construction debris to the landfill just so that people are compliant with code.
Yeah.
If the building works, it serves a purpose, it's functioning well, we want to be able to find a way to have that site specifically be reused and adapted towards the code and the intent and the purpose of the mixed use.
Yeah, that's exactly. It will be very tricky to write. We're not sure how we can do that, but we have to find a way, because those are, in many cases, going to be good, viable commercial uses that it will be much more sensible to readapt than to say, yeah, let's tear this all down and push it out to the street. There might be some way to do it right. We haven't figured that out.
Yeah.
Good point. The last thing on there, and then and again, to connect that all, still to do that all and still connect it well to the residential components, is not going to be easy to figure out, but we'll get that figured out. The last item is curb and access management, home deliveries, micro transit, ride sharing options. And I'll just go ahead and say, if you'd have told me when we adopted this plan, or any of the mixed use zones, that people were going to pay $12 for their Happy Meal to be delivered because they didn't feel like going to get it, I could not have anticipated that.
Now look at Diane. She would never pay $12 to have that delivered to her. Now Brett Hills would. I'm looking at Diane. There is no way she would pay. She would go pick it up.
I'm consistently surprised how many people are willing to have food delivered to them. But in addition to that, just the deliveries, it's beyond understanding. So we're trying to look at ways to better access, or to better manage curbside and access management for these mixed use projects, because they are very advanced.
Have different surrounding cities looked at this? I'm just curious.
Yes, but we're all kind of in the preliminary stages of how to deal with it best.
Yeah.
We try to push. We were really aggressive at pushing buildings to the street too. We only allowed a certain distance to that street, and now we're thinking we might want some of that not for people to park in permanently anyway, only while they deliver things or drop things off or whatever. So we were pretty aggressive in that. So we're probably struggling with it more than some others. But yeah, people are starting to look at curbside management is a really hot topic.
And it's interesting. If you've ever seen, I won't mention any businesses, but those curbside deliveries, they're aggressive.
Yeah.
And they'll park where they darn well please to get where they need to get to, because just time's money.
They're San Francisco's bike message.
It really is. That's a great analogy.
That's who they are. I admire them all very much.
Yeah.
Well, and there's another aspect of that as well, which is the rideshare services.
True.
And there's a lot of that's going on, and in a lot of larger metropolitan areas, there's the transit authorities there have like car sharing.
Yeah.
Like you have your green bikes, but you have a car that you can go check out of a central area in Chicago and use for 2 hours for a day to go run those errands that you can't do without a vehicle, like your 16 pack of paper towels from the club stores.
I buy those too.
Right. So there's that too. And people are looking, I think that can be a very convenient thing. And that's how some people may get around owning a car or having to have 2 cars if they're a couple. So access, drop-off pickups for that is also something to consider. And people who really enjoy the nightlife, they don't need a designated driver anymore, because they just click on their phone, get on their app, and have a designated driver show up within a few minutes. And so those are all things that really have changed drastically in the last 5 years.
A lot of changes. So we haven't started to sort of benchmark what people are doing with curbside management yet, but we're going to be doing that as definitely as a part of this, what proposal we bring forward. And it's not just in mixed use projects, it's everywhere, but more prevalent in mixed use projects because the buildings are so close to the street. So we really have to deal with it better than in other places.
Yeah, and I was on a call a few weeks back with various other economic development entities in the Salt Lake Valley, and I think everybody in a lot of ways is just kind of scratching their heads as to how to really write code to address these issues, because it's such a new thing, and the areas that have been in place for long enough to have these types of curb access be something that isn't new are those cities that have just had to adapt. You know, I'm thinking of like the larger cities like San Francisco and New York, and where, you know, a lot of the buildings downtown were built years and years ago, and they're older buildings, and they wouldn't have the luxury that we may have this time around to get it more right versus trying to go back and retrofit. So that's an added bonus that we have with the information. But I was amazed last year, and I'm sure all of you were, as you know, looked around and went and looked at how businesses adapted to the changes that were put in place because of the pandemic. And I think now the question that we're going to ask as we look in our crystal ball is how long-term are those changes? How many people are still going to want to continue to have their $12 delivery fee or for a Happy Meal? And that is one of those things where we'll gauge this and try and write the code that we feel like best addresses that. But also, I think, you know, Jared and I would be foolish to sit here and say that we're going to get it all right. And that's where it comes in. You know, we'll do our best. And as issues come up or new scenarios arise that maybe we didn't contemplate in code, then we come back and you know, consider, well, we missed this, and it doesn't make much sense to do that. In fact, as I've been sitting here listening to Jared and the council members speak, I've written down a few more things that I'll add to my my outline of everything that we need to address in the code. So we'll do our best to get it right, but you know, it's a huge task. It's one that we're anxious to really start moving on now that we have been able to identify and ascertain what most of the large issues are. But then knowing too that we don't want to over-regulate, we don't want to make it so restrictive that development can't come, that sites can't redevelop. When I watched the mayor's State of the City address on Tuesday night, and he referenced the loss of the R.C. Willey site and showed a picture of the site. And in my mind, I thought, you know, that's really what we're going to see from here on out, because the market for retail and commercial is no longer such that there's viability for a big box store to come in. And so if we don't figure out a way to have that site redeveloped, that is something the council can support and something that works for the developers and something that the community can live with, we end up having that building sit there vacant long term. They've already put a fence up around it. They've boarded the windows. They've already had, and the last I spoke with them, it was the beginning of last week. So it's been a week and a half. So that was the beginning of the second week of March. R.C. Willey vacated at the end of February. Within that first week, they'd already had 2 break-ins. And so So really, as that application came to us and we looked at that, part of our thought process was, again, knowing that we didn't have the best zone written for some of these further lying areas from transit, but the thought process was, well, we can either embrace a vacant building in the community, or we can embrace higher densities, mixed use, and having, apartments, townhomes, whatever on that site, because everything that's come to us in how long has been developers that are wanting to do the mixed use development, because it's the rooftops right there. There's always been the saying, the rooftops bring retail, but now it's the rooftops need to be right there in the same vicinity to have that retail be viable and long term. And I think when Gary Howland spoke about his site in particular, he articulated some of those concerns very well, and that he's saying, like, look, in the next 5 years, I don't know if my property or my project over there will be viable any longer without adding in the residential uses. So we do have a large task in front of us to try and draft code that can address all of these issues and be one that is acceptable to the community, to the city council. And I think it's also safe to say that we won't appease everybody. We may have, certain members of the community, whether it's developers or residents or neighbors, that may feel like it still is not a change that they want to see. But we'll do our best and try and get that balance to where it needs to be. So I think when the agenda was put together, you hadn't had a chance to see the memo that I had written to the mayor next week, which I think kind of outlines several things as what we see moving forward. So with the item that we're on right now being the mixed use zone overview and discussion on potential changes, I don't know if there's any questions you have specific to that after reading the memo, or what dialogue you may want to have now based on the mixed use zone.
We actually, I think, are on the TOD, the transit-oriented development.
Oh, okay.
Discussion. If you're finished with number 3, Jared.
I had one last question about mixed use and commercial use, if I can ask that before we continue on.
Sure.
I know we have a lot of just empty retail spaces now. How are we, even in your department, how are you actively looking for other organizations? I mean, if we're going to have commercial space within these mixed use areas, how are we going to continue to promote that and not just leave it to the developer or the owners to do that? But how as a city can we support businesses to come to Murray, even if it's a small mom and pop and business big boxes are scaling down? What are some of the efforts that we can see now and moving forward that we can promote within mixed use to make sure that commercial is happening?
That's a good question, and I'll try and answer it a couple different ways. But going back to what I said a minute ago, it's really hard to come back in later after a development is constructed and change buildings to serve a different need. There's a development agreement over in the Fire Clay area that required the ground floor to be constructed to 12 feet so that it could be converted in the future from residential to retail. The practicality of that in execution, though, is I would be very surprised to ever see that happen. So part of what we have looked at when we draft our code is that we want to require that commercial space up front. Because if we don't get it when it's constructed, we won't ever get it. And the benefit to the city is that the commercial properties are taxed at the full value of the property. So the residential properties are 60%, I believe. So we reap the benefit of commercial space, whether or not it's filled. And from that standpoint, that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we get that commercial space up front. But also from a realistic standpoint, the last thing that we want is to have a bunch of commercial space that never gets occupied. So there's a balance, and what that balance is still kind of remaining to be seen in some of these areas where there have been some of those commercial areas that haven't been filled yet. I know everything underneath Home 2 Suites on State Street, all of those units, I guess commercial units are filled. There's still some vacancies over at Murray Crossing off of Vine Street. To answer the question of what is my department doing to help facilitate occupancy of those, honestly, not a whole lot. We don't really have a program for that. We don't really have the staffing for that. It's something that I know other communities with different priorities, different staffing levels may have programs to assist with that, but that's something that we primarily have left to the building owners and to the landlords to fill that portion of their building.
The reason why I did bring it up is for that tax purpose, right? Like, it would benefit our city if those spaces were filled to reap in the benefits financially for even ourselves. And I mean, I would like to see a branch, maybe an arm within the department that can help with that, or working with local business or groups already. And that's why I brought it up, because it seems like sometimes it could be a very beneficial component, but also a very major component that we're missing that can help benefit us in the future. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, we get the bonus from not the bonus, but we get the revenues from the property taxes regardless. But if the space is empty, we do miss those opportunities of maybe additional sales tax or restaurant tax or whatever. So you're correct in noting that we are missing opportunities when there is vacant commercial space.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Okay, Jared, are you?
Those are
finished with 3?
Those are the items that we had identified, and then
for 3.
Yeah. So we did have.
Or was there one more?
Well, there's. I just had a slide, and we already talked about this. Why is mixed use development important? And that's, again, we've talked about all this because the world has evolved, and society and commercial and retail development is headed that way, and we need to be able to respond appropriately if we want our commercial to stay viable. So that's been talked about. We talked about, and it's in your memo, what we're kind of heading toward as a staff. We haven't written a lot of this stuff yet, but we think that a better approach to the mixed use zone itself is not to change the zoning of commercial properties, but rather to create an overlay that allows for that residential component and there may be 2 or 3 overlays depending on where that commercial property is. So because different things might be appropriate, and we want that to be able to come to you as a council. So it's not a zone change, it's an overlay that's already there, and it's activated by a development agreement that you review as a council to say they have to come up with, I'll go to the next slide and show you. Yeah, it's all, and this is basically just rehashing that.
Really
So
helpful.
We would require some sort of impact and necessity review. So we would look at traffic. We would get a traffic study. We might even get a market or housing study, depending on the size of the project. And again, we'd look at parking and phasing and all those kind of things. So you'd know exactly kind of how big the impact was going to be before you dropped that ability from the overlay to allow that residential component. So we've researched, and this is a good, clean way to do it. Several communities are already doing it this way for certain zones, and we felt like it would be more appropriate than just trying to write a bunch of different mixed-use zones that we would then try to re-implement in various parts of the city and have.
So it's not like you said, it's not a code.
Not a zone change. Not a zone change.
Code.
It would be applied to commercial zones in certain areas. And it would already be there, already existing, waiting to be dropped once you have a development agreement that makes you comfortable. So.
I really like the idea of the development agreement. I think that's.
Well, if you guys are all comfortable with that, that's probably the way we want to head forward on that.
I really.
One of the things,
I
one
like that.
of the added values that will bring to you as council members and to the public is a lot of times during the general plan amendments, the zone map amendments, we hear public comments that from people that are saying, how can you approve this when you don't even know what the project is? Right? I mean, you're laughing because I'm right. We get that a lot.
Oh, we know.
So this allows us to essentially approve the ingredients of a project before we give the go-ahead. And so it also allows us to hold a developer accountable. So when Gary Howland is saying, look, I only want to do 350 units, even though this zone allows for up to 1,000, that allows us, and how we would envision that working is that we would sit down with the developer, we would tell them what we have to have up front to start the process, which, obviously we have to know what's going into their project, the density, what they intend to do. We'll tell them, okay, we'll need a traffic study. We may want a market study. We may require a parking study. And when that information comes back, we then know that, because part of why Gary Howland is saying, I only want to do 350 units, is because his market study is telling him that's how many units would be sustainable over there. And also because he doesn't want to completely tear down everything on his site. Practically speaking, that's really about all he could do. So, but that gives us then the assurance that we're not going to have something constructed that can't be leased out, or that's going to be something that wouldn't be marketable. And then we bring, so we would work hand in hand with the developer, with Public Works, through the utility vetting process, and bring to the council basically a list of, here's everything the developer is going to promise. It's going to be no more than 350 units. There's going to be a mix of housing types. They want to do some apartments. They want to do some townhomes. It's going to include this much open space. And we have the code that then says, okay, once the city council approves, this is, as I referred to earlier, the list of ingredients, then we take that development agreement back to the Planning Commission. The developer works again with staff to go forward and create the site plan, to create all of the drawings and the renderings, and to ensure we work with them to ensure the parking is adequate. And the Planning Commission then takes that the rest of the way. We have an element of that right now, but we do it a little bit backwards with the mixed use zone when we have come to you after the Planning Commission has.
I've lost
Oh.
internet connection.
Oh.
We can still see you guys. We
Okay.
can hear you.
You can see us?
Guys.
Yeah, Rosalba and I have internet. We're good. It's
We
just
love
you
it.
guys.
You want to give it a minute to see if we can get back with the public?
Yeah, it looks like everybody in there got kicked off in the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, me too.
Is this where you just go forward because we said at the beginning of the meeting that technology may not?
Like Blaine's, when Blaine says 99.999 and then there's something that explodes.
Whenever GL gives us the we can legally go forward, I have a couple questions. It's harder for me to see him look stressed in the little camera though than in person. It's more exciting then.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we are still streaming live. Okay. So those of us who were on Wi-Fi in here. Okay, as long as we're still live streaming. But then we'll have the recording from Bill too. Okay. Okay.
You can't miss the meeting, Kat. Yeah, we'll host it for you guys. Don't worry.
Thanks.
Taking it over remotely.
Are we back? Are we okay?
Okay.
Okay.
So I think this approach satisfies some of the concerns that we hear from residents. It gives the council, hold on, sorry.
Did you say that it gives the council?
Okay. So it gives the council the confidence to know that the developer is going to deliver what he promises or she
Now, let me ask you
promises.
something right there. And this may, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but does that change GL's? I just know GL's going to shake his head no. I absolutely know this, so I don't know why I'm asking it. But does that give us any different ability as a council to talk more about the property? Because, before it was always, even though it kind of did happen a little bit, it was always no, it's about the change.
It would, because we wouldn't be talking about a use of the property.
Okay.
And where it gets hung up with that is that the general plan amendment, we're talking about the future land use. The zone map is the current land use. But if we have the commercial zone that allows for the residential use, we don't have to change the zone. We don't have to change the general plan. And so we're talking specifically about the project and not the use.
Not the use. All right.
Yeah, the trick with that is that oftentimes you'll have a property that'll go through a zone change or a general plan amendment, and then it changes hands, the project changes, and expectations are dashed because they were told it was going to be one thing, and when it changes hands, there's no controlling document in place to ensure that what was promised when that change was made would be what is delivered in the end.
No, I think that would be great. Kat, did you have a question?
It did. So it really goes well with what Melinda was just finishing saying as far as if the land transfers hands. Is it a permanent overlay or does it revert back to commercial or whatever it was before if the property's sold or if they want to change and do a new development? How does that work?
That's a good question. It would, so the overlay creates a use basically that's only allowed by that development agreement. So the overlay doesn't go away, but it goes back to inactive if they don't reach a development agreement. If they can't do the things that make it viable in the council's eyes, then it doesn't get, and by the parameters that we've established. So we've gone, the deal is that you go through the painful part of it when you adopt that overlay. So it's like you're adopting a zone change that's it's like you're adopting a zone change, but it's for everything all at once. And you don't implement that use except by development agreement. That's how we get the council to talk about it. So it reverts to being inactive, but it doesn't go away. And it's only activated by development agreement.
Yeah, I think the phrase we commonly use with that is entitlement. So the only way the residential use gets activated or entitled is through the mechanism of a development agreement. It's not just an automatic use that can be applied across the board without going through that process.
So it's a zone change contingent on the development agreement. If the development agreement
It's a
doesn't,
use allowance.
yeah.
Not a zone change necessarily. It's sorry, that's me. I'm finally back in. Sorry. And now you all know.
Mute. Yeah, so it's a use that's allowed in the zone, but it doesn't get entitled or activated until the city council gives the head nod with the development agreement.
So to your question, Councilman Hales, about how much you can talk about the property, to the extent that you're still within whatever parameters we've established, get reviewed. Parking and, how much parking is going to be needed, how dense is this versus our adequate public facilities review, everything that's been touched on by that traffic study we've asked for and the review of those public
And we can talk about all
talk
that.
about all those things. You wouldn't be talking about
New stuff.
you wouldn't be talking about the very great details.
Right.
You'd still have to leave that to the Planning Commission through design review. What exactly the buffer looks like and what the buildings what the buildings are going to be, the overall density and the parking and the things that are related to those adequate public facilities reviews, all those things that are the most uncomfortable for everyone, the most concerning, you get to review those things.
Yeah, that's amazing because we've never. I mean, that. If I ever had a wish list, that was one of them.
We're hoping that it works out that way.
Yeah, it puts you in a very difficult spot. And, and that's not to say that the public is going to like it any more than they do now. But the benefit is you would be privy to what the intended project is, whereas when we're talking at that very high level with just the uses, with the general plan, the future land use map and the zone map, we're only talking about uses and not the project.
I have a question.
Okay.
And I know how does this, or maybe it doesn't relate to HB 98, but how would this relate to HB 98, where developers would be given more of an opportunity to kind of do what they want if we don't have said inspector to kind of follow through these agreements that we will give them?
So that's the bill with the ADU.
No, that's 82. No. If we take too long in a building review, is that the one?
So that has, thankfully, even with our staffing challenges, we have not had really any issues with getting plan reviews through a process or getting building inspections.
Can you just refresh my mind on that, please, on that bill?
On the bill?
Yeah, so there was a bill that was passed that was run by the Utah Home Builders Association, I believe. And the notion behind it was that cities take way too long to review plans for residential properties and to get inspections scheduled. So there now will be an allowance for builders to hire their own plans examination or building inspectors if the city doesn't get through the process in the amount of time that the state statute allows. And we have not had that issue yet. So to answer that, I wouldn't think this would be a scenario that would apply to what we're planning on doing with the code revisions.
Okay. I figured if we ever, I don't know if we've ever found ourselves in a situation like that. So I just wanted to ask the question because I would hate to say, yes, let's do this and agree. And then we don't get a building inspector in time. And then developers like, well, that's voided now. So,
Yeah.
or if that leaves us in a loophole where it would be voided.
Yeah, I wouldn't see that situation happening with this. But I think it was that same bill that also put restrictions in place for a city to be able to require certain type of design elements in a development. And so that would be something then that, and I think that was specific to single family residential developments.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to have certain design requirements or criteria in code, which we do in some areas, TOD and MCCD, I think we're still okay to do that. But then, yes, I think that the development agreement could also be a mechanism to require those type of design elements, but you can't have it codified too.
Well, only for single family.
I think.
I think they might have taken that version out about single family homes.
Does not make it to
For
the end.
residents.
Yeah, I
Sorry, I was just curious on how this would
How
affect.
that might impact.
with
the-
building inspections, I don't see that being anything
Yeah,
of concern.
I wouldn't worry about that. Especially for the development agreement part of it, there wouldn't be I don't think that would be an issue at all.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to think if there's really anything else that from the memo.
Can I ask two questions?
Yeah.
Does this impact current mixed use at all, or is this completely separate for just future projects?
That's a good question. So we the overlay that we're talking about would not necessarily impact the existing mixed use zone.
Okay.
So the other parts of the agenda that Diane was referring to, TOD and the MCCD on the agenda, so the overlays that we're suggesting are the response and the way to deal with the hard questions that came up about changing zoning from this to mixed use. They wouldn't deal necessarily with the mixed use zone that we have. That would have to be separate. But some of those same items, some of those same issues, parking, density, traffic, et cetera, there are also issues with our other zones, with the MCCD, with the TOD, and with the MU. So we're not prepared to say exactly how to address those there, except that they'd be addressed in similar ways, depending on how much access they have to transit, et cetera. Those things need to be considered more stringently. And we're not of the opinion that they ought to be removed from the TLUR. We need to move forward with that and look at those things as well.
Yeah.
But
As crude as it is, but as Jared and I looked at our future land use map, one of the things that we felt like was, I think, a practical conclusion and a safe bet is that the areas of transition and change are going to be where those large scale commercial stores have been, those big box stores. And so it didn't make sense to us to have all of the zoning be changed to mixed use. It made more sense to look at the State Street corridor where we know Shopko's been closed for nearly 2 years now. We know that long-term Fashion Place has a desire to densify and have some residential housing on site. In order for either one of those to happen, they would either have to have a zone change or we added in to the commercial development code as the overlay with the development agreement. That said, we initially kind of thought, well, maybe we need a mixed use, low density use, kind of a mixed use medium, maybe a mixed use high. Jared looked at a lot of other cities and what types of mixed use they have on their books. And there's some cities that have 16 different mixed use zones. And
For every intersection.
right. So
We don't want to do that.
this is our attempt, or our thought is that we can get more of a one size fits all per se, but then still have a code that would provide for site specific flexibility. So if, let's say, the RC Willey building was deemed to be one that could be renovated and turned into residential, how do we have a zoning code that can provide for that to happen, but still meet zoning code? And that's where, flexibility has to come in, and a development agreement that can prescribe some of those differences based on the site specific versus trying to write a single code for every single different site and intersection. And that's not to say that we still in the future, I think we may have to have like a fashion place zone.
Fashion place overlay.
Maybe a fashion place overlay that would be different from the overlay that we're discussing now. But I think this approach that we've conceptualized, at least, is the best approach for the ones that have come before us at this point in time.
So for the last agenda items for TOD and MCCD zoning, that's kind of where we are. We're not looking at overlays for those. Those zones can stay intact and stay where they are in our conceptualization right now. We just still think we ought to address some of those same issues that have been brought up about the zone changes for those zones, so we don't encounter the same problems down the road as they redevelop.
Yeah. One of the things that has become, it was a question that we were being asked before the pandemic and everyone really having a lot of teleworking and all of that, but the live work commercial space, every time we've been asked by a developer, well, can I have the live work commercial space count towards my commercial space? And that may be appropriate in some areas, but I would think that's really not that appropriate, let's say at 53rd and State Street. The further lying areas, then yes, but then we would have to have a different parking requirement,
Right.
Because it would be a combined residential commercial space in the same unit, which is different than commercial space occupied on a ground floor or separately from the residential. So that's where people are having, like, I'm an attorney or a tax accountant and I just have my home office, and people come in and I meet with them in my main living or workspace area at home. Or if it was a massage therapist that had their own, or a salon or that type of a thing. So there's considerations that we wouldn't necessarily consider that a good application of commercial space in the TOD zone or the MCCD zone. But further out, like the sports mall area, that might be a workable solution for some percentage of the commercial space.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of concepts that really we need to vet out now that we're done with the information gathering portion. And then there's going to be also a lot of coordination between us and Public Works to ensure that we put in a process that can work for maintaining, the integrity of the services that are already promised to the residents that are here now, while still allowing for some growth and accommodation of redevelopment to occur. So now's where we start getting really busy if we weren't busy enough before.
Okay, now the TOD zone. Is it still relevant for Murray?
Yeah, we have, so the TOD zone essentially is fire clay area.
Right.
And there are some properties over there that have not developed yet, that may still develop. The foam factory is over there. That's about 6 acres. So I think there's still, we have the, I think it's now about 1.5 acres of the property that's on the north side of 4250 South, where we just built the new road last fall. So there are still properties over there that need to develop and will develop. They're not as large as they were with the development agreements that came through the RDA in the early 2010 through 15. So I think the TOD zone is still relevant to that area, still needs to remain on the books, but still has some of the challenges that we've identified just with the changes in society, that we would want to look at some of those and make sure that the allowances that we have are appropriate for the area. So I would envision that we would look at that commercial space requirement and, some of the other is density. Right now, the TOD allows for unlimited height and unlimited density. And that's something that what we have heard from the council, I think, and the community is something that really they're not comfortable with. And so, that may be, not maybe, but that's something that we'll look at. Now, again, practically speaking, when you only have 6 acres left, the cost of construction and development is a developer really going to propose a 15-story building over there? Well, who knows? But is that something that the council would feel comfortable allowing over there? And if the answer to that is no, then, that's definitely a portion of the code that we need to revise, because right now somebody could come in and they could put the 25-story building in and, as long as they can park it, they can build it. So it would be a little tough to do, but they could.
Yeah, and that's why I wonder if it's still relevant for Murray, that the TOD zone. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I think I agree with Melinda. I think let me see if I can answer it this way. I don't see us needing to rezone everything that's TOD right now to something else, because most of it is already built out. If we need to adjust a couple of things to make sure that nothing crazy happens on the last 8.5 acres to develop in there, great. We'd probably rather do that and leave it called TOD and leave all the zoning in place so we don't have to make major adjustments like that for not a lot of acreage left to develop. I think if we make sure there's some safeguards in place, we're probably fine in the TOD. We could stay.
Yeah, because getting to transit is not that easy.
Right.
And that's, part of the issue, I guess, with the TOD zones. So.
Yeah. Exactly.
These type of discussions, you can just tell our attorneys, they just love it. This is something they thrive for. You can't see behind his mask, but
These concept level discussions that, this is, to be fair, this is a lot to accomplish in the next 4 months. And, we also outlined, I think, a very, 6 months is aggressive period, but, we outlined kind of the proposed timeline. What I had listed in the memo really doesn't account for any margin of error, meaning if we take something to the Planning Commission on those dates and they're like, wait a minute, we don't like this, we want you to go back and revise it, that pushes us to a point where the moratorium expires and the codes aren't in place. So we intend to have a couple of, I'm going to call them reality checks, where we get some of this drafted, we come back to the council and we say, now we discussed with you the concepts in March. Now it's May, beginning of May, late April. Here's the more refined data, the more refined code. And is this something you're comfortable with? And we want to have a dialogue like that with you. We want to have that also with the Planning Commission. And then that gives us kind of the sense of security of, yes, once again, we're headed in the right direction. And we finalize and get that in front of the Planning Commission so that we can get it back to the council by the time we need to. So there, you know, we can, this is kind of the worst case scenario. We can definitely, I think, move things up a couple of weeks if we anticipate running into a bump. But I think that's really critical, where we had some great conversations with all 5 of you council members the beginning of February, right after we did the TLUR, where I think, you know, Jared and I really tried to listen to your concerns. We've even gone back and listened to the city council meetings where you discussed the items in January and in February, so that we were encompassing and hear everything that we were identifying with concerns. So it's going to be very tricky to try and get all of that out in text and code, but you know, we'll do our best. We'll come back for some reality checks, and what I'm hearing from you today is that you feel comfortable, at least with what I've kind of outlined in the memo and the direction that we're anticipating going in. So that's good news for us.
Definitely.
I think so. Are there other questions? Anything else from the council? Because I think we've covered about everything.
I just want to say it's probably the best discussion I've had in this area my entire time. So thank you. And thanks for Kat and Rosalva, who are off in, where are you?
They're home.
I know.
We're home.
I know. You had some
We're
great,
here.
you had some great questions or great statements that help. So thank you.
No,
Well,
thank you. It was useful for sure for us, especially being newer. I mean, I know I read this before I ran for office, and I reread it again and reread it all the time. It's something I reference all the time, and it's useful to kind of go through, and of course there's always more questions. And I really welcome the public to read it as well. It's on the website in the PDF format, and it's there for review for anyone.
Well, we truly, Jared and I, appreciate the time that we have had with you today. I think it's been very beneficial for everyone. And, you know, I feel frankly very privileged that you would care enough about this to ask us to come and spend 4 hours with you. So thank you for that opportunity. And we're always here to answer any questions you have. If you see something on the Planning Commission agenda, you know, give us a call. And then, you know, the other benefit of us doing this is that, I mean, when you go to the training sessions that are put on by the League or Utah Land Use Institute, they're not specific to Murray City. And so this is really a great benefit for you to see, practically speaking, how your planning and zoning staff implement on a day-to-day basis the general plan and the code and how it works for us. So we appreciate that opportunity to explain that to you.
Definitely.
And thank you for the time and preparation. You guys did a great job. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, you've gone to a lot of work, and I agree with Brett and Diane, everybody. This has been very informative, but for every hour we spend listening to you, you've got 4 or 5 hours in preparing, and I don't want that to go unacknowledged.
Thank you very much.
Well, I told Jared to take tonight off, but he
I
has
got a
a
planning commission
he
meeting.
has a planning commission meeting. So
It's a short one.
Take the night off. It's 4
The best
o'clock.
I built in 2 weeks. I'm
Jared,
good.
when we're done, just go home. He's like, I can't. We have planning commission.
Jared does more work at home maybe than, no, he's a busy guy.
I don't want to go.
He's a busy
There's
guy.
a lot of stuff to do.
He has more fun talking about planning at work than he does at home with his kids. So
That's true.
All right.
Jared, how many kids do you have? I'm just curious because you talk about them like there's many.
There's 6 of them. Three. I only
fun.
have 3 still at home. Three have moved out. So it does happen eventually for any of you that are waiting. They do start to move out.
He was waiting. I want to be 18.
Exactly.
All right.
No, it's great. Yeah, 6 altogether. So
Thank you.
thanks, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank
We're
you.
adjourned. Yes, I'm sorry. We're adjourned.